Have you ever wondered, history, the very thing we're taught to trust without question, is it truly the only honest picture of our past? Or is it just a tapestry woven from ambition, power, and fear? How many treasures of knowledge were burned to protect the pride of the victors? How many maps, statues, and ancient texts quietly vanished simply because they raised inconvenient questions? And if all of it were brought to light, perhaps our entire worldview would be turned upside down. This isn't a story about cheap conspiracy theories. This is a journey into undeniable cover-ups. Those moments when the truth was edited, when our collective memory was redefined to serve a greater order. There's a paradox few are willing to admit. History is not only about what happened, it's about what people decided was allowed to be told. Since the earliest civilizations, power has always come with the privilege of shaping memory. Emperors, churches, dynasties, and empires didn't just build monuments to celebrate their victories, they burned libraries to the ground, scraped names off stone tablets, and erased their rivals from the records. This wasn't random forgetting. It was a silent project, carried out patiently, with a destructive force more enduring than any weapon. When a civilization collapses, people usually remember the crumbling walls and the charred temples, but what always burns first is memory itself. A single missing manuscript can sever thousands of years of understanding. A revised timeline can wipe away the legacy of an entire people. And a story branded as heresy becomes taboo, surviving only as a trembling whisper in the dark. Some scars are too obvious to ignore, like the Library of Alexandria burning in the night or archives buried deep within the vaults of the Vatican. But there are subtler wounds, a research paper that never gets published, an ancient map dismissed as imaginative fiction, an archaeological question quietly removed from the curriculum to avoid controversy. And with every act like this, the past bends just a little more. Gradually, we grow up believing that history is a clear, linear chain of events, unchanging and absolute, when the truth is often complex, contradictory, and full of shadows. It's this silence that should terrify us most, because when no one dares to ask what has been hidden, the keepers of memory no longer need to burn any books. They only have to wait until the next generation forgets there ever was another story. Ask yourself, who is holding the pen that writes the chronicle the whole of humanity is forced to believe? Are you ready? Because once this door opens, you will never look at the past the same way again. When people think of the Library of Alexandria, they often imagine a vast treasure trove of ancient wisdom, a sanctuary of priceless papyrus scrolls containing works on astronomy, geography, medicine, philosophy, language, and far-off legends gathered from every corner touched by the Greek and later Roman empires. Some historians believe that at its peak, the library held over 700,000 scrolls, an astronomical number for any library of its time. But what haunts us today is not just the scale of its archives, but the mysterious and tragic way it came to an end. The burning of the Library of Alexandria has become a symbol of immeasurable human loss, not just of ink and parchment, but of entire memories and truths that were stripped from future generations. According to surviving accounts, the first destruction occurred around 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's siege of the city. Fires from the harbour spread into nearby storehouses, consuming tens of thousands of scrolls. But that wasn't the last catastrophe. Successive events, Aurelian's invasion, Theophilus' decrees banning pagan beliefs, and eventually the Arab conquest, each swept away more of the library's traces like waves eroding a shoreline. Still, many modern scholars argue that these weren't just accidents of war. Some theories suggest there was a deliberate effort, a systematic will, to eliminate pluralistic knowledge, a kind of knowledge that questioned divine authority, political permanence, and the origin myths of rising religions. Why, some ask, were so many unique manuscripts about Egypt, Persia, Assyria, and lands beyond the Mediterranean gathered in Alexandria, and why did they all vanish together? Was it mere coincidence that toward the end of the Roman Empire, Christian clergy viewed the preservation of pagan teachings as a threat that had to be eradicated? Some indirect evidence, letters from Alexandrian philosophers and Roman scholars, hints that scrolls may have been smuggled out before the fires to be hidden. But no one knows where they went. Other theories suggest the most dangerous works, those that challenged religious or political authority, were intentionally destroyed first. Then the fires were allowed to spread through the rest, erasing the evidence in one final blaze. You could think of the library as a mirror, one that reflected the world too clearly, too truthfully, for those in power to tolerate its existence. Inside its walls were alternate creation myths, cosmic models that didn't center humankind, and records of parallel civilizations that thrived without submitting to a single authority. Had those pieces survived, the story of humanity might have been told very differently, not as a neat, linear tale of chosen empires, but as a rich, tangled tapestry of ideas and discoveries. Today, all that remains are fragments, scattered references, and sorrowful letters from scholars lamenting their loss. Centuries have passed, yet the debate over what truly happened still burns on. Was it a tragic accident, a stray flame in the chaos of war? Or was it a carefully veiled operation clearing the collective memory to make room for a new declaration of power? That question still lingers, defying every attempt at closure. And it leaves behind a vast emptiness, not just of missing pages, but of the belief that knowledge will survive, so long as no one makes it their mission to destroy it. After the tragic tale of Alexandria, few realized that during the same era, in another corner of the Hellenistic world, a second great library rose to become a formidable rival, Pergamon. Perched atop a high hill in Anatolia, Pergamon was not only the capital of a powerful kingdom, but also a vibrant cultural hub, where the ambition to collect knowledge was pushed to its limits. At its height, the Library of Pergamon housed over 200,000 scrolls, making it the second largest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, just behind Alexandria. Historian Pliny the Elder recorded that the kings of the Attalid dynasty dispatched agents across Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor to buy or copy any manuscript they could find, as if every scrap of knowledge was a prize more valuable than gold. That ambition, however, made Pergamon the center of a quiet but intense rivalry, what some modern scholars call the Library Wars. According to the geographer Strabo, Egypt's Ptolemy V banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon in an attempt to stall its growth. Cut off from traditional writing materials, Pergamon scholars innovated, developing pergamina, or parchment, made from treated animal skins. In return, Pergamon aggressively pursued rare manuscripts, especially those Alexandria hadn't yet acquired. This wasn't just an academic competition, it was a battle of soft power. Whoever controlled the largest trove of knowledge held the upper hand in shaping intellectual authority across the ancient world. But Pergamon's golden age dimmed as Roman influence crept into Asia Minor. In 133 BCE, upon the death of King Attalus III, the kingdom of Pergamon was bequeathed to Rome through his will, setting the stage for full annexation. And just before that transfer of power, something strange happened. A large portion of Pergamon's most precious manuscripts vanished. According to accounts by Plutarch and scattered correspondence that survived, many scrolls were removed under cover of night or destroyed outright. The most widely accepted theory suggests this was an intentional purge meant to deny Rome the use of Pergamon's cultural capital as a tool of control. Others propose that Roman envoys themselves collected and redistributed the works, transferring them to Rome or Alexandria, which by then had also come under Roman influence, to centralize knowledge within the empire's grasp. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Much of Pergamon's intellectual legacy was never seen again. Catalogues disappeared. Original works by philosophers, historians, physicians, and poets vanished from the Roman record. In the shadows of power shifts, knowledge became a silent hostage, not merely removed from its native community, but absorbed into another archive where others held full authority over what would be preserved, what would rot, and what would be erased from memory entirely. One modern scholar remarked, "If Alexandria was the story of a treasure burned to ash, Pergamon was the tragedy of a treasure dismantled layer by layer, quietly, systematically, until only cold stone walls remained as witnesses." And in that silence it becomes nearly impossible for future generations to tell what was lost naturally to time and what was deliberately erased to monopolize knowledge. If the theories are correct, the cleansing of Pergamon's library before its handover to Rome may have been a strategy to ensure that later generations would never access the uncensored stories, the ones that might have challenged the official history being written. And that leaves us with a chilling question. How many times in history has knowledge been buried, not because it was useless, but because it was too dangerous for a new order to tolerate? Pergamon is just one example, but it reminds us the collective knowledge of humanity is far more fragile than we think. And sometimes real power isn't in owning the information, it's in deciding who's allowed to know it. After the destruction of Greco-Roman knowledge in Alexandria and Pergamon, our attention turns eastward to another immense and refined body of literature, the early Buddhist manuscripts of ancient India. Beginning in the 3rd century BCE, under the Maurya Empire and the reign of Emperor Ashoka, Buddhist scriptures were compiled and disseminated across the Indian subcontinent. Monks, envoys, and scholars carried handwritten texts, often recorded on palm leaves, bark paper, or etched into stone. According to early records, these manuscripts were preserved in major monastic centers such as Nalanda, Vikramashila, or Dantapuri, and many smaller institutions throughout India. For centuries, these archives were believed to contain the most complete and unaltered collections of early Buddhist teachings, including sutras in their original form and early commentaries retaining their true semantic depth. And yet, most of these manuscripts have vanished. Scholars argue that this loss cannot be explained solely by time, climate, or natural decay. In the 12th century, India underwent violent upheavals as Turkish and Afghan Muslim forces swept through the region. Monasteries were attacked, libraries burned, monks were slaughtered or forced to flee. In the 13th century, the Persian historian Minhaj-e-Siraj described the destruction of Nalanda not merely as a massacre, but as a systematic effort to wipe out Buddhist intellectual foundations seen as obstacles to Islamization. He wrote that the flames engulfing Nalanda's library smoldered for 3 months, and even from a distance, passers-by could smell the burning of ancient paper carried on the wind. But what puzzles modern researchers even more is the lack of surviving records about manuscripts that monks may have removed before the invasions. Some legends suggest that in an effort to preserve the Dharma, monks fled eastward, carrying precious scriptures into Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. Others speculate that a significant number of texts were hidden in remote Himalayan caves, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Yet centuries have passed and no reliable evidence has surfaced to prove that the original manuscripts were ever recovered. What remains today are mostly later transcriptions, heavily edited, translated into Chinese or Tibetan, or reinterpreted through different schools of thought. As a result, scholars can no longer be sure which versions reflect the Buddha's earliest teachings and which have been reshaped over time. Some historians of religion argue that the loss of early Buddhist knowledge was not just a result of war, but also of rivalries between Buddhist schools and shifting political agendas. Each new dynasty had its own reasons to favor or ignore specific texts. Commentaries or philosophical critiques that challenged orthodox views were often deemed dangerous, potentially divisive, and deliberately left out of large-scale copying projects. For centuries, the transmission of Buddhist teachings was not a neutral process. It was shaped by the forces of religion, politics, and academic control. No one can say for sure how much truth was quietly trimmed or concealed while still resting on the library shelves of great monasteries. This quiet disappearance leaves behind a deep void in our understanding of early Buddhism. Had the original manuscripts survived, we might see a very different picture of how Buddhist thought formed and spread, perhaps a richer variety of early schools, or deeper ties between Buddhism and pre-Vedic Indian philosophy. Today, archaeologists still uncover the ruins of Nalanda and Vikramashila, remnants of bookshelf pedestals and foundational blocks that once supported vast libraries. But the most vital parts, the pages, the words, the subtle insights, have vanished. Their absence suggests not just neglect, but a strategic erasure of collective memory, executed so quietly that no one has ever named the hand that started it. Like Alexandria and Pergamon, the story of India's lost Buddhist manuscripts is not only a tragedy of knowledge destroyed, it's a reminder that the history of ideas has never been immune to the touch of power. And in the end, we're left with a single, haunting question. Were those scriptures truly burned to ash? Or are they still out there, sleeping in some hidden mountain hollow, waiting for a time when humanity is brave enough to face the full memory of itself? If Alexandria, Pergamon, and the Buddhist monasteries were victims of war and covert campaigns to control knowledge, ancient China witnessed something even more chilling. A state-sponsored, publicly declared, and historically recorded purge of knowledge, the infamous burning of the books and burying of the scholars under Emperor Qin Shi Huang. This was not merely a symbolic act, it was, in scope and intent, one of the most extreme and methodical efforts to erase collective memory ever recorded in human history. According to the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Tian, the decree was issued in 213 BCE, just after the Qin dynasty unified the fractured warring states into a single empire. The stated goal was to unify thought to support the newly established regime. But many scholars today believe it was also a calculated move to eliminate historical reference points and suppress any intellectual challenge to the emperor's legitimacy. The event began with the council of Prime Minister Li Si, a staunch legalist who believed in ruling through strict law and ideological conformity. Li Si feared that Confucian scholars and rival schools were still secretly passing down the histories and philosophies of the former states, sowing doubt about the righteousness of Qin rule. The edict demanded that, with the exception of books on agriculture, medicine, divination, and engineering, all historical records, poetry, and classic texts from the former kingdoms be surrendered for destruction. Those caught hiding such materials faced harsh punishment. Within months, an enormous number of texts were collected in the capital of Xianyang and burned in public bonfires at the imperial court. In those flames, it wasn't just bamboo strips and parchment that turned to ash, it was the spiritual and intellectual legacy of hundreds of years, philosophies on virtue and music, historical chronicles, reflections on morality and human order, all erased, so that history could be rewritten under a single imperial narrative. Some say that night, the red glow of burning books lit the entire horizon, while scholars watched helplessly, unable to speak out without risking death. A year later, the regime carried out a second, even darker act, the mass execution of Confucian scholars, buried alive as a brutal warning that no dissent against the emperor's authority would be tolerated. However, records from the following Han dynasty, which replaced the Qin, may not be entirely objective. Some modern historians suggest the scope of the purge was exaggerated, perhaps as propaganda, to vilify Qin Shi Huang and legitimize the Han's rule. Archaeological finds have confirmed that certain texts survived in remote regions, hidden by local officials or noble families. Yet even if the extent was embellished, the core truth remains. The Qin dynasty set a dangerous precedent, centralized power claiming the right to decide which knowledge could be preserved and which must vanish. What makes this event especially distinct from other knowledge purges is its open declaration and blunt justification. No excuse of war or religion was needed. The regime plainly stated that intellectual pluralism was a threat to authority. From that moment forward, an empire that built the Great Wall and engineered massive infrastructure projects also planted a deep seed of instability, because no order built on forced amnesia can remain truly stable. Today, as archaeologists examine the ruins of Xianyang and sift through the surviving bamboo strips, questions linger. How many texts were lost before they could be copied? How much ancient knowledge on astronomy, philosophy, governance, and ethics was reduced to ash? And deeper still, did those flames truly suppress thought, or did they instead fuel the longing in future generations to recover a stolen memory? The Qin book burning stands as one of the clearest examples of a recurring truth in human history. When power reaches its peak, it doesn't just seek to rule land, it seeks to rule memory and control the very language of truth. And from the ashes of those texts, a question still rises. What else remains buried in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed, to reveal the real origins of an empire? After the fire of Xianyang consumed the collective memory of ancient China, history bore witness to yet another tragedy, this time across the ocean, in the jungles and stone pyramids of the Maya civilization. Few realize that Mesoamerica once housed thousands of intricate manuscripts, codices made from bark paper, amatl, coated with white lime, and inscribed with one of the most complex hieroglyphic systems in the ancient Americas. Each codex was more than a religious text. It held astronomy, mathematics, calendrical systems, and royal chronicles, a vast treasury of knowledge developed over centuries. And today we only understand a fraction of what was lost. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula in the early 16th century, the fate of this knowledge was sealed. In the name of Christian evangelization and colonial consolidation, the Spanish clergy labeled Maya manuscripts as demonic heresy. The most infamous event came in 1562, when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered a massive book burning in the town of Mani. In his own writings, Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, de Landa described collecting every Maya codex he could find and burning them in public, believing them to be the lies of the devil. Hundreds of years of accumulated wisdom, preserved in delicate bark paper scrolls, were reduced to ash, while Maya elders and scribes were tortured to reveal their sacred rites. The bitter irony is that Diego de Landa, the man who destroyed most of the Mayas' written legacy, is also the one who left behind the most detailed account of their writing system, a paradox that continues to provoke debate. It wasn't until the 20th century that scholars were able to decode parts of the Maya script, but without the codices there is simply not enough material to fully reconstruct their calendar systems or historical records. Out of thousands of manuscripts, only 4 codices are known to have survived: the Dresden Codex, Madrid Codex, Paris Codex, and Grolier Codex. All of them are now housed in Europe, a stark reminder that the knowledge created by the Maya no longer belongs to the descendants of its creators. Some modern historians argue that this destruction was not purely religious fervor, but also part of a deliberate cultural erasure. By forcing native populations to convert, colonizers stripped them not only of their gods, but also of the written memory of their origins, ancestry, and land ownership. In the context of colonization, knowledge became a tool of power. Whoever controls history controls identity. The burning of books, then, was not just symbolic, it was strategic, designed to redefine the identity of an entire civilization. Today, when we walk through the ruins of Palenque, Copan, or Tikal, it's impossible not to wonder how many stories were lost in that fire. Advanced astronomical charts, dynastic epics, formulas for eclipse cycles, agricultural rituals, all reduced to smoke. Researchers may never grasp the full depth of Maya thought. Each codex destroyed was a missing piece of an unfinished puzzle. And here lies the final paradox. To reconstruct Maya history, scholars have had to rely on the writings of the very man who ordered its destruction. With all his biases and religious zeal, De Landa still left behind a glyph key, the only tool that enabled the 20th century to begin decoding this lost world. But the burned pages will never return. And no one can say how many secrets still lie beneath the ashes, unrecoverable and silent. This story raises a question with no satisfying answer. Was the fire at Mani simply the inevitable result of a clash of civilizations and faiths? Or was it part of a deliberate strategy, ensuring Maya knowledge could never again challenge colonial narratives or demand its own place in the world? And if that fire had never been lit, would we see the pre-Columbian history of the Americas with clearer, less distorted eyes? After the fires that consumed the Maya codices, the story of erased knowledge takes us back west, to a text once embraced by early Jewish and Christian communities, only to vanish abruptly from the official Bible. This is the story of the Book of Enoch, a manuscript both deeply revered and harshly rejected. According to tradition, Enoch was the seventh patriarch after Adam, a man who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without experiencing death. But what makes the Book of Enoch so extraordinary isn't just its mythic tone, it's the cosmic worldview and theological ideas that clashed profoundly with the doctrines that later came to dominate organized religion. Also known as 1 Enoch, or the Book of Enoch, the text is composed of several sections, the most famous being the Book of the Watchers and the Book of the Luminaries. These writings tell of a group of angels, the Watchers, sent to Earth, who fall into temptation, teaching humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, ritual practices, and more. The result, according to the text, was an age of corruption and chaos, culminating in a great flood. These narratives posed unsettling questions for religious authorities. If God's plan for salvation was singular and sovereign, how could there be rogue angels acting independently, gifting humans with sacred knowledge? And if humanity was punished for acquiring knowledge, where exactly was the line between wisdom and sin? During the first few centuries CE, the Book of Enoch was widely read by early Christian communities and the Essenes at Qumran. Fragments were even quoted in the New Testament. Jude 1:14 directly cites a prophecy from Enoch, signaling its once prominent status. But by the 4th century, at the councils of Nicaea and Laodicea, the book was excluded from the official biblical canon, deemed of uncertain origin and heretical. From that point on, copying and distributing the text was banned. In the Latin and Greek Christian worlds, it faded into near total obscurity. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved it, maintaining the Ge'ez version as part of their biblical tradition. To the rest of Christendom, Enoch became an apocryphal and dangerous work, surrounded by rumors and theological discomfort. For over 1,500 years, European scholars only encountered it through vague references until the 18th century, when Scottish explorer James Bruce brought several handwritten copies back from Ethiopia. The discovery stunned the academic world, offering the first full glimpse of a text that contained elaborate cosmologies, numerological mysticism, and complex portrayals of supernatural beings. Some scholars argue that the suppression of the Book of Enoch wasn't just a theological decision, but part of a broader strategy to control religious knowledge. When the Church sought to define a unified, unshakable dogma, text that referenced forbidden knowledge or spiritual forces beyond divine control posed a threat. If knowledge could be imparted to humanity outside of God's direct will, the Church's exclusive claim to salvation began to falter. In this light, the Book of Enoch had to disappear to prevent opening a door to questions that extended beyond approved theology. Today, as we study the surviving text, echoes of Babylonian, Egyptian, and pre-Judaic mysticism can be heard within it, suggesting that Enoch was a bridge between ancient wisdom traditions long since severed. And the questions remain: how many lost versions of the book once existed? Did earlier variants explore even more radical ideas about the origin of human knowledge? And most importantly, if the Book of Enoch had never been suppressed, would our understanding of religious history look completely different? The long silence around Enoch until the 18th century is proof that not all knowledge is lost in fire. Some is buried in darkness, sealed off by those with the power to define what counts as truth. And in the end, we are left with unsettling questions. How many other pages of knowledge once existed, only to be quietly removed, so that history could be flattened, simplified, and made easier to control? If the disappearance of the Book of Enoch evokes an image of forgotten wisdom buried in silence, then the story of the Gnostic texts is far more dramatic, a deliberate and highly organized campaign to erase spiritual knowledge, all in the name of protecting the one true faith. Gnosticism, or the Gnostic tradition, flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, when communities from Egypt to Asia Minor began offering radically different interpretations of the universe, the divine, and the human condition, ideas that clashed sharply with the emerging orthodoxy of the early Christian Church. To the Gnostics, the material world was not the perfect creation of an all-powerful God, but the flawed construct of a lesser being, the demiurge. They believed that the human soul was trapped within the body, and only through gnosis, mystical, hidden knowledge, could it ascend back to a higher divine realm. To the early church, these ideas were not just doctrinal errors, they were theological threats. If salvation could be found within, without the church's sacraments, the entire institutional foundation of authority would begin to crumble. Gnostic texts circulated among tightly knit communities, meticulously copied onto papyrus scrolls. They recorded mystical dialogues, many believed to be secret teachings given by Jesus himself to disciples capable of decoding their deeper meaning. The Gnostic library was vast: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocalypse of Adam, and many others. The Gospel of Thomas in particular was controversial for declaring that the kingdom of God resides within each person, no mediator required. By the late 2nd century, church leaders like Irenaeus recognized the growing influence of these heretical texts and began a fierce campaign to eliminate them. Gnostic writings were condemned as forgeries designed to mislead the faithful, and anyone caught copying or preserving them faced excommunication or even execution. Over the centuries, most manuscripts were systematically destroyed, seized in monastery raids, or buried in secret to escape persecution. The campaign was so effective that for over a millennium, the only knowledge of Gnosticism came from the hostile writings of its enemies. That all changed in 1945 when an Egyptian farmer near the Nile River stumbled upon a sealed clay jar containing 13 papyrus codices, the now famous Nag Hammadi library. Inside were over 50 Gnostic texts, preserved almost entirely intact, containing sayings, revelations, and discourses never before seen by modern scholars. When translated into English and other languages, the texts revealed a rich and metaphysical worldview, a cosmos woven from realms of light, souls born of a divine realm above, and earthly power, including religious institutions, viewed as mechanisms of spiritual imprisonment. For many researchers, this discovery radically expanded our understanding of early Christianity, revealing a plurality of voices before a single version of the faith became orthodox. Some scholars caution against romanticizing Gnosticism as wholly innocent or persecuted. Many Gnostic groups were insular, claiming exclusive access to ultimate truth. But one thing is clear: for over 1,000 years, anyone who copied or preserved Gnostic writings risked death or total expulsion from the religious world. Today, as the Nag Hammadi texts circulate freely in modern languages, a deeper question emerges. If these texts had not been destroyed, would Christian history still appear as a single thread, or as a chorus of competing truths? More profoundly, the Church's willingness to ban dozens of works outright shows that religious authority has often been built not just through preaching, but through gatekeeping memory, deciding what is allowed to exist in the collective mind. The Gnostic story leaves us with a question that echoes across time. Were the scribes hunted to protect the faith or to protect its power? And if memory can rise again from a forgotten clay jar, how many other fragments of the past still wait to be unearthed, ready to shake the foundations of what we think is the only history? If the story of the Gnostic texts reveals a deliberate effort to suppress opposing religious knowledge, the tale of Babylon's lost writings exposes another dimension entirely, one where vast treasures of ancient knowledge vanish without a trace, and centuries later an eerie silence surrounds anyone bold enough to ask why. Babylon, the legendary city along the Euphrates, was once the intellectual crown jewel of Mesopotamia. Its scholars etched thousands of clay tablets, preserving knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and myth. At the height of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, the royal library and dozens of temple archives are believed to have held some of the oldest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, detailed ritual texts, and long dynastic chronicles dating back to the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian eras. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, many records were reportedly copied and taken to Persepolis. Later, Alexander the Great's campaigns led to further collection and displacement of ancient texts, many of which disappeared during the chaotic power struggles of his successors. And yet scholars believe that large caches of tablets remained sealed and untouched for centuries in hidden chambers beneath the ruins. In the 19th century, British and French expeditions began excavating Babylon. But from the start, inconsistencies and contradictions emerged around what was found and what was reported. Famed archaeologists like Hormuzd Rassam and Robert Calderway documented the recovery of thousands of clay tablets, so many that they could not be catalogued in time. Early reports hinted at the discovery of previously unknown chronicles detailing dynasties and events that didn't align with the then accepted narrative of Babylonian and Assyrian history. According to some independent researchers, these inconvenient texts slowly disappeared, either quietly buried in backroom archives at the British Museum, Berlin's Pergamon Museum, or scattered into private collections, never fully disclosed to the public. Part of the controversy stems from the reluctance of academic institutions to release or even acknowledge certain materials. Many tablets were generically classified as administrative records or commercial accounts, with no published photographs or transliterations. Modern Assyriologists often cite a lack of manpower to translate the overwhelming number of tablets. But skeptics ask, if these are just routine receipts, why the secrecy? Could some of these tablets contain chronologies, myths, or astronomical records that challenge the foundational assumptions about Mesopotamian civilization? The story grows murkier with reports of Babylonian tablets appearing in private auctions across Europe and the US, only to vanish into personal vaults. In recent years, some fragments have resurfaced through legal disputes over artifact ownership. Among them are texts revealing unknown rituals and detailed accounts of cometary cycles, descriptions that rival or predate what 19th-century Western astronomers believed were modern discoveries. The paradox is striking. In a modern archaeological world that prizes transparency, some institutions maintain total silence on the fate of Babylon's more mysterious writings. Scholars have even coined the term academic grey zone, a realm where artifacts exist but are unnamed, unpublished, and inaccessible. Within this zone, speculation flourishes, from bureaucratic delay to intentional suppression, born from a fear that certain findings might destabilize the historical narrative modern scholarship has carefully constructed over the last century. Today, as young researchers walk the ruins of Babylon, they continue to ask, if these ancient records were fully translated and made public, how much of Mesopotamian and even Near Eastern prehistory would have to be rewritten? And more deeply, is the long silence surrounding these texts just a byproduct of chaotic excavation, or is it quiet evidence of a protective effort to preserve the familiar framework of knowledge by withholding truths that don't fit neatly within it? After the debates surrounding Babylon's lost texts and the enduring silence of academia, our journey leads to yet another extraordinary discovery, this time not hidden in ancient royal archives, but buried deep within a dry cave near the shores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, are widely known for containing the earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and numerous Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. But among the hundreds of fragile parchment and papyrus fragments, there is one object, unlike any other, the only scroll engraved on metal that has sparked endless speculation and controversy since its discovery: the Copper Scroll. Unlike the other scrolls which focus on theology or legal codes, the Copper Scroll is entirely practical in nature. It lists approximately 60 secret locations, each paired with detailed amounts of gold, silver, and precious objects supposedly hidden in caves, underground chambers, and ruins scattered throughout Jerusalem and the Judean desert. According to the text, the total treasure amounts to dozens of tons of precious metals, a staggering quantity that even the most cautious archaeologists admit is baffling. Since its discovery in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952, the Copper Scroll has undergone a long and difficult decoding process. Due to severe oxidation, experts were forced to cut the scroll into separate segments just to read the inscription. In 1956, lead researcher Josef Milik released the first translation, asserting that it was indeed a literal inventory of hidden treasure. And yet for decades, no official archaeological effort, not by Jordan, Israel, nor any international academic institution, has made a public attempt to locate the treasure it describes. Scholars remain divided. Some believe the scroll is symbolic, perhaps a religious metaphor or ceremonial instruction. Others, including archaeologists like Vendell Jones, insist that the list is entirely real, possibly detailing treasures hidden by the Essenes, or Jewish priestly factions, during the Roman siege and destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Israeli records have hinted at quiet investigations of certain sites, but their findings have never been fully disclosed. This raises a troubling question. If the Copper Scroll is merely symbolic, why was it engraved on metal, an expensive, rare preservation method reserved only for texts of immense importance? And if the treasure worth billions in modern value, were real, what has stopped governments from pursuing it? Some theories suggest that verifying the scroll's claims could lead to complex religious and legal disputes, especially involving the sovereignty of Jerusalem and claims over ancient Jewish heritage. Others propose a more cautious explanation, revealing that the treasure was never found, or worse, that it was removed long ago, could diminish the mythic aura of the scroll, undermining the symbolic power of the entire Dead Sea Scrolls collection. And as history often shows, ambiguity fuels allure. Today, the original Copper Scroll is housed in the Jordan Museum, while replicas, photographs and translations are displayed in institutions around the world. But the locations it describes, from the tomb in the valley of Achor to the cave marked by 2 stone pillars, remain unexcavated, or at the very least no verified findings have ever been made public. Among archaeologists, many admit quietly that the topic is too sensitive, not merely because of money, but because it touches the theological and historical legitimacy of one of the most hotly contested regions on Earth. Thus, the story of the Copper Scroll becomes yet another symbol of how knowledge can be suppressed, not by fire, not by censorship, but by a quiet, coordinated silence among those with the most to lose if the truth were fully revealed. And once again, we're left with a familiar question. Will a forgotten fragment of the past ever rise to shatter the fog of legend? Or will the truth remain sealed away, buried beneath the thick dust of closed archives? From the mystery of the Copper Scroll and its untouched treasure sites near the Dead Sea, history leads us to one of the most hotly debated topics of all, the reports of giant human skeletons unearthed across the United States, only to vanish under puzzling circumstances. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, dozens of newspapers, archaeological journals and local records reported stunning discoveries. Human remains measuring between 8 and 10 feet tall, often buried alongside weapons, jewelry, and intricately crafted artifacts. Some of the most frequently cited sources include the New York Times, Scientific American, and regional papers like the Nevada Tribune. In 1877, a correspondent reported the discovery of a giant skeleton in a tomb in Eureka, Nevada. In 1891, massive bones were allegedly found at Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. Throughout the Ohio Valley and the mound regions of Indiana, similar reports emerged, painting a picture of a forgotten race of giants. What makes this story more complex is the involvement of one of America's most respected scientific institutions, the Smithsonian Institution. According to various accounts, Smithsonian representatives were often quick to take custody of the remains for research and preservation. But despite the headlines, none of these skeletons ever appeared in public exhibitions or official reports. Over time, they disappeared, surviving only in old newspaper clippings and the oral histories of local communities. This opacity fueled countless theories. Many authors claimed that the Smithsonian and possibly other federal research entities deliberately destroyed the remains and artifacts because they challenged the foundational assumptions of modern anthropology, which rejects the existence of a parallel race of giants in prehistoric North America. In 2014, an article caused a stir when it claimed that the Smithsonian had been forced to admit to destroying thousands of anomalous skeletons. The institution quickly responded, calling the story an outright hoax, and firmly denied the existence of any such records or remains. Still, skeptics argue a denial is not the same as disproof. They point out that many artifacts have been lost to time within vast, underfunded museum archives, some uncatalogued, others misfiled. Independent historians suggest that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were formative years for evolutionary theory and modern anthropology. Any discoveries that disrupted the emerging rational picture of human origins may have been quietly dismissed, ignored, or deemed unreliable. Thus, the image of the giant skeleton has become a symbol of that murky space where folklore collides with institutional control over knowledge. Among Native American tribes, such as the Iroquois and Choctaw, there are long-standing legends of red-haired giants who once ruled the land before being wiped out. And when reports of large skeletons appear in the same regions these myths describe, the line between history and collective imagination becomes harder to draw. Today, the mound structures still dot the landscape of the American Midwest, and local museums occasionally display odd relics, thick bone fragments, oversized tools, but no complete skeleton has ever been independently verified, transparently preserved, or made available for open academic review. This absence of evidence only deepens the intrigue, fueling both suspicion and fascination. And like the Copper Scroll, this mystery leads us back to a familiar question. Was the disappearance of evidence a coincidence, simply a byproduct of early archaeological chaos, or was it part of a conscious effort to keep human history neatly contained within familiar boundaries? In the quiet spaces between these questions, the grassy mounds, untouched and unmarked, stand like anonymous tombstones, challenging us to dig deeper, even if we're not ready for what we might find. After the tales of missing giant skeletons and allegations of evidence destruction, the issue of archaeological knowledge control becomes even more pronounced when we examine the fate of countless excavation reports compiled during the 19th and 20th centuries, many of which have quietly vanished from public archives. During the early days of modern archaeology, from the late 1800s to the 1930s, national archaeological societies and major museums in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States launched extensive expeditions across the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. These missions produced detailed reports, including drawings, artifact descriptions, and thousands of photographs. At the time, many of these documents were publicly accessible, or at least available to researchers through academic libraries. And yet, strangely, by the mid-20th century, especially after World War II, many of these reports disappeared from circulation or were pulled from public catalogues under vague explanations like archive reorganization. One frequently cited example involves the British archaeological missions to Iraq between 1920 and 1935. These reports included notes on layered architectural sites in Nineveh, Nimrud, and Kish, and described artifacts whose dating conflicted with accepted chronologies. Even T.E. Lawrence of Lawrence of Arabia fame remarked that some tablets with puzzling inscriptions were quietly stored away, deemed too difficult to explain. By the 1950s, many of these reports no longer appeared in the British Museum's library catalogue and have never been fully republished. A similar case involves the American Institute of Archaeology's reports on the Cahokia Mounds and Etowah Mounds, published in the 1890s to 1900s. These documents described structures and artifacts suggesting a far more complex indigenous civilization than the primitive tribal culture narrative of the time allowed. According to some researchers, by the 1930s, many of these original records were recalled for correction of errors. Yet the corrected versions were never released. Independent historians attempting to access the originals were told the files were either no longer extant or temporarily unavailable. In France, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, AFO, had once archived thousands of glass negatives and notes from early 20th century expeditions in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Some of these records documented inscriptions, symbols, and dates that could have forced a re-examination of Angkor's or Mai Sun's historical timeline. But by the 1970s, many archive boxes were sealed, citing the Indochina Wars and the need for preservation. Nearly half a century later, only a fraction of these materials has been declassified. The rest? No one knows where they are. These cases lead to an unsettling question. Why do excavation reports, supposedly neutral academic documents, disappear so easily from public access? Is it possible that inconvenient data, which contradicts well-established historical models, has been quietly pulled to preserve theoretical consensus? Some scholars take a more cautious stance, blaming bureaucratic disarray and underfunded archives. But for those who have personally requested access, only to be met with the same scripted responses, politically sensitive, pending verification, or awaiting review, these explanations ring hollow. Behind those closed archive doors may lie nothing more than unremarkable notes, or they may hold pieces of evidence powerful enough to challenge mainstream narratives of human civilization's evolution. And when access to data is controlled by a select few, the public is left with a sanitized version of history, clean, cohesive, and easy to digest. The disappearance of these reports never sparked a major scandal. There's no lost gold, no monumental ruins, only silence and the growing void it leaves behind. But that silence invites a final pressing question. How many times in modern history have original documents been withdrawn, not for preservation or correction, but simply to prevent a new generation from seeing a version of truth too inconvenient to accept? After stories of vanishing archaeological records, our journey circles back to a place so iconic it risks being overlooked through overfamiliarity. The Giza Plateau in Egypt. For centuries, the three Great Pyramids have stood as towering symbols of ancient knowledge and power. They have drawn archaeologists, explorers, and tourists alike, each hoping to solve mysteries that have never quite been exhausted. But beneath the luminous limestone facade of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, Cheops, lies another world, one few have seen, a labyrinth of shafts, subterranean chambers, and vertical pits, largely inaccessible to the public. The largest of these, known as the subterranean chamber, sits directly beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, more than 30 meters below ground level. As early as the 19th century, explorers like Flinders Petrie and Giovanni Caviglia documented its layout in great detail. A rough-hewn room, unfinished passageways leading into darkness, and a deep shaft with no clear bottom. Petrie described it as a relic, possibly ritualistic, or never completed. For decades, these underground spaces remained accessible to researchers and even a few daring explorers who managed to descend into the depths, capturing photos and measurements. But beginning in the late 1990s, Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, under the leadership of Zahi Hawass, suddenly restricted access to the lower chambers. The official reason? Structural safety and preservation concerns. Yet, oddly, the upper passages of the pyramid remained open to tourists who could buy tickets at the gate. This selective closure sparked immediate suspicion. Independent researchers, including Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins, claimed that radar scans and ground-penetrating surveys suggested the presence of larger voids beneath the subterranean chamber, possibly undocumented rooms or ancient artifacts yet to be disclosed. They pointed to preliminary findings from the Scan Pyramids project, which used Muon tomography to peer inside the stone structure. The scans revealed unexplained cavities, including a substantial void not accounted for in previous architectural models. In response, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities denied any cover-up, insisting that all research efforts were aimed at preservation and no shocking discoveries had been made, contrary to Western media narratives. Still, the tightly controlled communication, lack of transparency, and repeated delays in granting excavation permits left many wondering if something deeper was being deliberately withheld. In ancient Egyptian belief, the pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a gateway between worlds, a cosmic bridge from Earth to the afterlife. Classical texts from the Hellenistic period refer to the underground chambers as the Hall of Trials, where the soul faced darkness before it could be reborn. If these structures do house early religious rites or lost texts, it's not hard to see why excavation and disclosure could become sensitive matters, capable of reshaping humanity's understanding of ancient Egyptian theology. To this day, the only images of the deepest chambers are grainy black-and-white photos from a bygone era, or clandestine snapshots taken before restrictions were tightened. Official explanations continue to revolve around the familiar phrase, "further research is needed." And yet it's precisely this silence, this vacuum of information, that suggests the truth has already been pre-filtered, released only in fragments, at times deemed appropriate. Standing on the sunlit Giza plateau, surrounded by crowds taking selfies, it's easy to forget that beneath your feet may lie chambers that no one has fully explored or been allowed to. And the question lingers, what really rests within the stone? A sacred archive, a ceremonial room, or simply an empty space? But more importantly, why, for decades, has the decision to open or close that space belonged to so few, while the rest of the world is left only to guess? After the tale of sealed chambers beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza, we shift our gaze to the opposite side of the world, to the legendary waters of Lake Titicaca, the natural border between Bolivia and Peru, and the mythic cradle of Andean civilization. Sitting over 3,800 meters above sea level, Lake Titicaca is not only the largest freshwater lake in South America, but also the sacred site where, according to Inca mythology, the children of the sun first emerged to found an empire. The Spanish conquistadors once heard whispers of sunken stone cities hidden beneath the waves, but it wasn't until the late 20th century that modern technology began to test that legend. In 2000, an ambitious international archaeological project, sponsored by the Bolivian government, the Andean Archaeological Research Institute, and several European organizations, conducted deep-water sonar scans and diving expeditions. In preliminary reports, the team confirmed the existence of a massive submerged architectural complex spanning thousands of square meters, stone walls in geometric patterns, stepped foundations, monolithic columns, and a variety of ceramic artifacts, figurines, and ritual objects. The announcement sent ripples through the South American research community. Many archaeologists speculated that the site could represent a major pre-Inca ceremonial center, perhaps linked to the Tiwanaku civilization, 5th, 12th century CE. But some details, such as the style of the stonework and iconography, didn't quite match known Tiwanaku patterns. A few cautious scholars began to ask a bold question: could these ruins predate Tiwanaku altogether, hinting at an even older, forgotten civilization? And then everything stopped. Just as the findings were gaining international attention and journals prepared to publish in-depth analyses, the project was abruptly suspended. All excavation and research were paused, with official reasons cited as lack of funding and cultural sensitivity. Requests to access recovered artifacts were denied, even to researchers who had been involved in the initial phase. Several European sponsors withdrew funding entirely, and the project's documents were effectively sealed indefinitely. Independent archaeologists were baffled. They noted that the original funding had been secured years in advance, and that continuing the excavation would have required relatively modest resources. Local communities around Lake Titicaca, rather than opposing the research, had shown pride and willingness to collaborate, casting doubt on the claim of cultural sensitivity as a genuine barrier. Some began to suspect, could the findings under the lake contain information disruptive enough to challenge mainstream narratives of Andean civilization? Or perhaps stir up unmanageable debates about ancient timelines or even transoceanic cultural connections. A more conservative theory points to internal conflict between scholars and sponsors, but even this doesn't explain one central fact. In over 20 years, no full sonar maps, no detailed artifact inventories, and no carbon dating results have been made public. Only a handful of images and scattered press releases remain, just enough to confirm the site's scale, but not its nature or chronology. Today, tourists cruise across the shimmering waters of Lake Titicaca, unaware that beneath those waves may rest a chapter of human history never told in full. The stone walls sleep in silence, and the records about them lie hidden in locked drawers, with no sign of when or if they'll ever be opened again. The question is no longer just who built those submerged structures, but what caused a widely announced excavation to vanish from public view? And more profoundly, how many fragments of ancient memory have been discovered only to be sealed away by bureaucratic decision before they could take their rightful place in human history? From the sunken stone walls of Lake Titicaca, our journey now takes us across the world to the remote Bayan Karaula mountain range straddling the border between Tibet and China, one of the most isolated and treacherous regions in all of Asia. It was here, in the late 1930s, that a controversial archaeological story began, one that would come to be known for its strange artifacts, sudden silence, and persistent mystery. These are the stories of the Dropper Stones. According to scattered Western reports from the 1960s onward, the original expedition was led by Chinese archaeologist Chi Pu-te, who set out to study a system of high-altitude limestone caves over 3,000 meters above sea level. Within the caves, the team allegedly discovered a series of small tombs containing unusually shaped skeletons with elongated skulls and short, frail bodies. But what shocked the team most was the presence of over 700 circular stone discs, each about 30 centimeters in diameter, less than 2 centimeters thick, with a hole in the center, and covered in finely etched spiral grooves filled with tiny, unknown symbols. In 1962, a man named Professor Tsum Nui, said to be affiliated with the Beijing Academy of Ancient Studies, reportedly began deciphering the symbols. He claimed the spirals were not decorative, but a form of ancient hieroglyphics. His translations allegedly told the story of beings who came from the sky, crash-landed in the mountains thousands of years ago, and were eventually forced to survive among the native people. Their tale included conflict, reconciliation, and eventual interbreeding between the two groups. If true, the Dropper Stones would constitute one of the oldest recorded accounts of extraterrestrial contact, a claim that stunned both believers and skeptics alike. But then, something strange happened. Shortly after this information was translated and leaked to the West, Tsum Nui's research vanished. His name was nowhere to be found in official Chinese academic directories. The Beijing Academy denied knowledge of any such project. No peer-reviewed journals published his findings, and over time, the existence of the Dropper expedition itself was called into question. Western scholars who tried to follow the trail hit dead ends. There were no official records, no institutional response, just a long, unbroken silence. From that point on, the Dropper Stones became a symbol of the twilight zone between truth and fiction. Skeptics dismissed the entire story as a hoax, pointing to unverifiable sources and the absence of solid documentation. But independent researchers countered, no one has ever definitively proven it false either. There has never been a public, official denial, only a complete and collective silence. Some accounts claim a few of the Dropper Stones were briefly on display at the Xi'an Museum before being removed. Today, however, no publicly verified specimens remain in any museum or archive. What makes the story harder to dismiss entirely is that the technical descriptions of the Dropper Stones are consistent with ancient Tibetan traditions of inscribing symbolic texts onto stone discs. Some ethnographers argue that the tale may represent a fusion of real archaeology and local mythology, referencing long-held legends of star-born tribes who descended from the heavens. But even so, no one has ever explained why hundreds of finely crafted stone discs, if real, would leave behind no photographs, no detailed studies, no institutional paper trail. Critics have called it one of the greatest hoaxes of the 20th century. But for many in the archaeological fringe, it's the absence of denial, the vanishing of records, and the uniform silence from Chinese institutions that raise eyebrows. The dropper stones remain trapped in a paradoxical space, impossible to confirm, yet suspiciously difficult to disprove. Today, few passing through the Bayankara Ula Mountains know that this quiet, windswept range was once the epicenter of an enduring debate about the boundaries between archaeology and myth. And like so many stories before, it is not certainty that sustains the legend, but a coordinated silence. And so the question still hangs in the air. If the Dropa stones were merely a fabrication, why has no one officially refuted them? But if they were real, what was discovered on those discs that caused such a total blackout, as if the entire event had never happened at all? From the vanishing dropper stones in the high mountains of Bayankara Ula, the trail now leads us to a concept that's as fascinating as it is controversial. U-parts, short for out-of-place artifact. Coined by zoologist Ivan T. Sanderson in the mid-20th century, the term refers to ancient objects whose age, technology, or context appear inconsistent with the civilization that supposedly produced them. What makes U-parts such a sensitive topic isn't just their challenge to established timelines, it's the way they're handled. Many large museums have briefly acknowledged, even temporarily displayed, these anomalous items, only to quietly withdraw them later, labeling them unverified artifacts, or storing them indefinitely in off-limits archives. One of the most famous examples is the Antikythera mechanism, a complex bronze device recovered in 1901 from a sunken ship off the coast of Greece. Its intricate gear system baffled scholars for decades. Only much later did researchers confirm it was an ancient astronomical calculator with precision comparable to an 18th century mechanical clock. Today, it is proudly displayed at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. But for nearly half a century, the device was kept in storage, dismissed as too advanced for the known timeline of ancient Greek technology. Another frequently cited case is the Baghdad battery, a ceramic jar with a copper cylinder and signs of acidic residue, discovered near Ctesiphon, Iraq, in 1936. Some have proposed that it functioned as a primitive electrochemical cell, possibly for gold plating. Because this didn't align with existing views of Parthian-era technology, the artifact sat largely ignored in the Baghdad Museum for decades, only drawing attention after a Western publication featured its photo. And there are countless others, the Klerksdorp spheres of South Africa, with seemingly perfect grooves etched into metallic nodules. The London hammer embedded in a sandstone formation, or pre-Columbian carvings that appear to depict flying machines. All follow a familiar trajectory, sudden media buzz followed by withdrawal from exhibition, reclassification as uncertain provenance, or quiet transfer to private collections. Skeptical archaeologists argue that most U-parts are either misunderstood or overhyped, misdated objects, later intrusions into older strata, or even modern forgeries. But the real paradox lies in this. Instead of publicly studying and debunking them, institutions often choose silence. They remove them from catalogues, close files, or refuse discussion. This silence is what feeds larger suspicions that human technological history may be more complex and non-linear than academic models allow. Today, as visitors stroll through the pristine halls of prestigious museums, Few realize that beneath their feet, or deep in storage, hundreds of such inconvenient artifacts might lie untouched. They're not authenticated enough to display, yet not destroyed or discarded. They exist in a limbo of denial. The story of parts isn't necessarily an accusation of conspiracy. It may be the byproduct of institutional discomfort, the fear of destabilizing a knowledge system too long considered settled. Because if a gear mechanism 2,000 years ahead of its time, or a ceramic battery from antiquity, were definitively proven authentic, it would force us to rewrite textbooks and rethink civilization as we know it. And perhaps that's why these artifacts remain on the margins, reduced to black and white photos, obscure publications, and unanswered questions. From the out-of-place artifacts quietly gathering dust in museum basements, our story now drifts into the East China Sea, where a submerged stone formation once ignited a decades-long debate: Yonaguni, a sunken monument or a natural phenomenon. Located on Japan's westernmost island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, Yonaguni became the focus of global attention in 1986, when a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake stumbled upon a massive rock formation around 25 meters beneath the waves. Early photographs astonished the scientific community. The stone blocks formed near-perfect terraces with sharp 90-degree angles, polished flat surfaces, and grooves that resembled channels or corridors. Following the discovery, a research team led by Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus began underwater mapping and documentation. In early reports, Kimura described Yonaguni as an enormous architectural complex, including what appeared to be a pyramid-like structure, entry gates, ceremonial stairs, narrow ritual paths, and even faint relief carvings on the walls. He cautiously proposed that the formation could be the ruins of a man-made structure submerged at the end of the last ice age, possibly over 10,000 years old. If true, this would challenge long-standing views about the history of Japan and East Asia, suggesting the existence of a prehistoric civilization capable of large-scale stone engineering long before recorded history. But as media coverage surged, the response from Japanese archaeological and geological institutions grew increasingly cautious. Japan's Geological Society issued an official rebuttal, stating Yonaguni was simply naturally eroded sandstone. Even more curiously, Kimura's own team, the very group that had published the initial findings, began to withdraw from international media. By the early 2000s, interdisciplinary research funding had dried up, and the team's full survey data was no longer publicly updated. Efforts to continue research were quietly shelved. Independent researchers, including Graham Hancock and a Channel 4 documentary crew, attempted to investigate Yonaguni themselves. They reported that key information, sonar imaging, 3D scans, and measurement data had become difficult to obtain. Requests for new funding were met with silence, as mainstream Japanese academics distanced themselves, wary of association with what was quickly being dubbed the Eastern Atlantis. Skeptics argued that Yonaguni is nothing more than a rare geological anomaly, where natural fractures and erosion happen to resemble architecture. But others quietly asked, if it's only a natural formation, why has so much of the original survey data disappeared? Why aren't sonar scans and 3D maps published in peer-reviewed journals for open scrutiny? Today, if you visit Yonaguni, you can still hire local divers to explore the underwater terraces. You can run your hands along the flat stone surfaces and trace the sharply angled corners beneath the turquoise waves. But you'll be hard-pressed to find a complete official report with side-by-side geological and archaeological evaluations. The story of Yonaguni doesn't just ask, what might humans have once built beneath the sea? It raises an all-too-familiar question. Why was a major discovery first celebrated then quietly buried in silence? Is it fear of disrupting historical orthodoxy, or perhaps just excessive academic caution in the face of a hypothesis too bold to be accepted? And most of all, will Yonaguni remain a monument drowned by waves and silence? Or will someone someday be patient enough to uncover its final truth? If Yonaguni raised doubts about how old certain ruins might truly be, the story of medieval architecture in Europe touches on something even more delicate. Has someone, at some point, deliberately revised the dates of ancient structures to make history more linear, more manageable, and less controversial? Since the 19th century, as historians and architects began systematically cataloguing medieval churches, castles, and fortresses across Europe, two primary data sources were relied upon: ecclesiastical and royal records and architectural analysis. But over time, small inconsistencies began to emerge. In England, France, and Germany, several sites were found to contain foundation stones, tunnels, or wall segments built using techniques distinctly different from the rest, some resembling Roman construction or even older. Prominent Gothic cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, and Strasbourg are key examples. During 19th century restorations, architects like Viollet-le-Duc noted foundations with Roman-style bricks and carvings, but those notes were left vague, never incorporated into the official dating. Why? Because most restoration projects were tightly supervised by the church and historical commissions, both of which were invested in preserving the image of Christian medieval Europe as the clear starting point of all grand architecture. In England, debates arose over structures like Dover Castle and the Tower of London. Subterranean chambers showed mortar and stonework resembling late Roman methods. Early 20th century archaeologists like Frederick Bligh Bond publicly questioned whether many so-called Norman or Plantagenet structures were actually built atop much older foundations, with their timelines altered to legitimize newer dynasties. Such questions were often dismissed as unserious and left out of academic journals. In Germany, Marksburg Castle, a symbol of medieval military architecture, has long been dated to the 13th century. Yet a 1972 survey using radiocarbon dating on mortar and carbonate stone yielded results several centuries older. Researchers were visibly uncomfortable. The results were labeled non-representative, and the official 13th century dating remained unchanged. Some argue there's a simpler explanation: cultural layering. In the Middle Ages, builders often repurposed Roman forts or Carolingian ramparts, expanding or adapting them, then branding them anew. But often these reused materials and older layers were ignored or simply rolled into the date of the newer construction, creating the illusion of a seamless, monolithic history. For many historians, this raises an uncomfortable question: how much of medieval Europe's architectural heritage is truly original, and how much is rebranded legacy from a deeper past? The truth is even harder to uncover when 19th and 20th century restoration records are missing pages, altered, or left incomplete. In France, some of the original notes from the foundation surveys at Chartres Cathedral were lost during World War II, and no full copies survive. Skeptics say the erasure and soft editing of building dates isn't a conspiracy, it's just narrative convenience, a desire to craft a simplified history easier to teach, to memorialize, and to link to national pride or church authority. After all, a neat timeline is easier to digest than the chaotic overlap of migrations and Rome's collapse. But in that convenient simplicity, a grey zone of memory emerged, where bricks 1,000 years older than the wall above them are still labelled 12th century, just to fit the plaque. And when independent researchers suggest that some structures may predate their labels by a full millennium, the only response they often get is silence. Today, as we walk beneath the stone arches of medieval castles and Gothic cathedrals, Few stop to ask, when was this wall truly built? How many times has it been torn down, rebuilt, renamed, just to serve a cleaner historical narrative? And more importantly, are we ready to confront a more tangled, less convenient truth, if the original records were ever fully released? From the stone walls of Europe, where timelines may have been quietly adjusted to fit cleaner narratives, we now return eastward to a culture famed for its meticulous record-keeping, Imperial China, and in particular the Song dynasty, which ruled from the 10th to 13th centuries. The Song left behind some of the most extensive historical archives in East Asia, including official dynastic histories and comprehensive chronicles. But buried within these volumes are subtle signs of revision, suggesting that even the most detailed histories may have been strategically edited. During the Song era, from the reign of Taizu to Ningzong, court historians were responsible for recording daily events, edicts, military campaigns, natural disasters, and political cases. Works like the History of Song, Song Shi, extended continuation to the comprehensive mirror, Zu Ji Tongjian Changbian, and Song Hui Yao became definitive references for generations of scholars. What's less commonly discussed is that these texts were subject to at least 2 major rounds of editorial revision, each under tight control by the emperor or state cabinet. According to modern scholarship, the first wave of editing began as soon as Emperor Taizu consolidated power after the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. To justify the Song's legitimacy, many earlier events were reinterpreted. Commanders who had resisted the dynasty were recast as rebels, and the Song court was portrayed as the singular force restoring order to China. In some early northern Song records, original passages were either shortened or rewritten with a more accusatory tone. The second major revision occurred under the Yuan dynasty, which conquered the Song. A committee of court historians was formed to produce the official Song Shi, the version still most widely cited today. It's a voluminous, detailed work, but 20th century Chinese scholars like Chen Mu and Chen Yingke noted numerous oddities: key figures vanishing inexplicably from the timeline, major political trials disappearing or being reduced to a single vague sentence. One notable case is the official Lu Wendei, who had been involved in political reform under Emperor Huizong. According to contemporary accounts, he was wrongly accused, but later exonerated and reinstated. Yet in the Song Shi, that rehabilitation never appears, leaving only the image of a disgraced official. Why was that omitted? Perhaps because the Yuan regime had no interest in honoring reformers aligned with Song ideals. Another example is the secret diplomatic negotiations between the Southern Song and the Jin dynasty. Original correspondence had once been cited in temporary court records. But in the final Song Shi, those documents vanish, replaced by second-hand summaries. Though no official reason was ever given, many historians suspect the Yuan editors sought to suppress reminders of Southern Song concessions, which could spark unrest in the newly conquered territories. What's striking is that many modern academics accept the Song Shi as authoritative, citing its coherence and systematization. But that very cohesion raises red flags. When a fallen dynasty's history is written by its conquerors, where is the line between recording the truth and rewriting it for a new legitimacy? Even today, much of the Song Chronicle remains uncross-checked against scattered local archives, family diaries, and stone inscriptions. Independent historians still try to piece together these fragments, but their work is often dismissed as unverified or too troublesome to pursue. And perhaps the most sobering thought is this: if a powerful dynasty like the Song could edit trial records, erase negotiations, and leave behind a version of history reprinted for centuries, can we be certain that these records reflect the one true version of events? Or are they a carefully crafted story designed to smooth over contradictions and keep the public from ever asking what lies beneath the polished surface? If the Song Dynasty chronicles showed how victors reshaped the past, then ancient Egypt offers a different tale, one of a powerful ruler deliberately erased by his own people. To this day, original documents about him remain sealed in archives, their content still unknown. Over 3,000 years ago, Pharaoh Akhenaten rose to power and launched the most radical religious reform in Egyptian history. He proclaimed Aton, the solar disk, as the one true God, challenging the dominance of the traditional priesthood devoted to Amun, which had been entrenched for generations. Akhenaten ordered the construction of a new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, and issued sweeping decrees that transformed rituals, art, and historical record-keeping. After his death, Egypt's rulers moved swiftly to perform a damnatio memoriae, a formal erasure of memory. His name was chiseled out of temple walls, his statues destroyed or buried, and in later dynastic records he was mentioned only vaguely as a criminal against the gods. Yet despite this campaign of destruction, many original records, including letters, decrees, and internal reports, were not destroyed but rather sealed away in temple archives, storage rooms, and private tombs, yet to be fully excavated. In the 19th century, European archaeological teams began digging at Amarna and uncovered thousands of clay tablets and inscribed fragments known as the Amarna letters. Some were published, revealing a fragile Egypt struggling to control its territories while the royal court was consumed with religious reform. But the majority of these materials, including lists of tribute, named correspondence, and internal memos, remain unpublished, stored within the archives of the Cairo Museum, the British Museum, and private collections across Europe. Modern scholars such as Nicholas Reeves and Aidan Dodson have asked a simple but important question. Why, after more than a century, have so few of these primary records been fully released to the public? Common explanations include lack of qualified translators, preservation priorities, or academic sensitivity. But others suspect a deeper motive, that if the full Amarna archive were unveiled, Akhenaten's legacy might prove far more complex than the label of heretical tyrant. He may not have been merely a religious fanatic, but a political reformer who threatened the elite priesthood's control, a threat subsequent dynasties had no interest in remembering. Another mysterious thread deepens the story. Among the unreleased tablets, some are said to detail the succession after Akhenaten, including the relationship between Tutankhamun and Nefertiti, proving or disproving whether Nefertiti ruled after Akhenaten, or whether Tutankhamun was his biological son, would not just alter academic timelines. It could also impact claims of heritage, and even the political status of institutions that manage Egypt's antiquities today. In modern Egypt, access to the Amarna archives remains restricted. Only a handful of researchers are granted access, and excavation permits often take years, if granted at all. Among archaeologists, a half-joking phrase circulates, "Amarna is always open, but never invites you in." Today, as tourists crowd around the golden mask of Tutankhamun, few realize that just a few hundred meters away, wooden crates containing the story of his father have sat untouched, collecting dust for centuries. And the quieter question is this: if, one day, the Amarna tablets are fully translated, how many chapters of Egyptian history, long assumed to be true, will have to be rewritten from scratch? If the sealed Amarna archives show how power can erase a king from memory, then medieval Europe reveals a different kind of story, one in which the Church became the ultimate gatekeeper of knowledge, deciding what was allowed to be passed on and what was to vanish from collective memory. From the 4th century onward, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church rapidly constructed a system of intellectual control. It extended beyond theology, asserting its influence over history, natural sciences, philosophy, and medicine. By the Middle Ages, cathedral schools and later the first European universities became the exclusive centers for training the continent's educated class. This system did preserve great legacies: the Latin language, classical legal traditions, and ancient manuscripts. But it also created an unprecedented filter on ideas. Any text deemed incompatible with doctrine or likely to disrupt theological authority was subject to revision, suppression, or outright destruction. A prime example is Origen, a 3rd century Christian theologian who wrote hundreds of commentaries on Scripture. Among his radical ideas were beliefs in the pre-existence of the soul, universal salvation, and even the possibility that evil itself would be redeemed. By the 6th century, the Second Council of Constantinople condemned Origen as a heretic. His writings were systematically purged, with only fragmented citations surviving in cloistered monastic libraries. Another case is that of Greek medical knowledge. Texts by Hippocrates and Galen were initially preserved, but as translations, especially from Arabic sources, emerged, the Church demanded rigorous censorship. Passages that contradicted the idea of the soul governing the body, or that proposed disease might arise from natural, not divine, causes, were often excised or suppressed. By the 13th century, control reached its peak when Pope Innocent III issued decrees requiring all universities to follow official curricula. Any unapproved Aristotelian texts, especially on natural philosophy, were banned. In 1210, the Council of Paris declared, "No one shall teach or listen to the natural philosophy of Aristotle, either in public or in private." Though these restrictions gradually loosened, they left a deep mark. Knowledge had to be approved by divine authority. Even as institutions like Bologna, Oxford, and Paris gained prominence, they remained under ecclesiastical oversight. Chancellors were appointed with bishop approval, and course content required church sanction. Thinkers who pushed boundaries, like Roger Bacon, who explored optics and chemistry, were closely monitored and sometimes placed under house arrest. A more formal mechanism was introduced in 1559. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, which lasted nearly 4 centuries. It banned any work deemed a threat to doctrinal orthodoxy. Among the blacklisted, Copernicus, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and Spinoza. In its harshest periods, mere possession of these books could lead to confiscation of property or even execution. To be fair, the Church also preserved enormous amounts of classical knowledge. Monastic scriptoria painstakingly copied thousands of texts, without which Europe may have lost its Greco-Roman legacy entirely. But the essential question remains: did this monopoly on knowledge also ensure that only sanitized, controlled versions of that legacy were passed on? Today, when we leaf through 1,000-year-old manuscripts in the Vatican Library, it's nearly impossible to tell which texts are originals and which are subtle revisions. For centuries, the Church held the power to define truth, to decide what qualified as orthodox knowledge and what was heresy. And perhaps the most sobering question is this: if every story had to pass through the Church's gate before reaching the light of day, are we truly reading history, or just the version of history someone believed we were allowed to know? If the Church's control over educational content carefully shaped the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe, then the Vatican's secret archives, now formerly known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive, represent the pinnacle of silent authority. A vast vault of centuries-old history, correspondence and records, sealed behind doors few are ever allowed to open. Located next to the Vatican Library, the archive spans nearly 90 kilometers, 55 miles of shelving, a number that would astonish any historian. Its contents are staggering: diplomatic correspondence, inquisitorial transcripts, papal decrees, court diaries, internal memos, and letters between European monarchs and popes from the 8th century to the present day. It sounds like a treasure trove of knowledge open to any earnest scholar. But in reality, for centuries, this archive was entirely off-limits. The term secretum in Latin doesn't necessarily mean secret in the modern sense. It originally meant private or personal. Technically, many of the documents are simply internal records, not classified, but the tradition of restricted access and the refusal to publish widely turned the archive into a living legend, a sealed chronicle of hidden histories, some of which may never see the light of day. Only in 1881 did Pope Leo XIII begin allowing limited access to scholars, but even now the process remains incredibly strict. Each year, only a small handful of researchers are granted access. Applicants must submit detailed academic credentials, letters of recommendation, and specify exactly which documents they wish to consult. Browsing is not allowed. Photocopying entire documents is forbidden. Researchers may request only a limited number of documents per day, and handwritten notes must be reviewed before leaving the reading room. Those who have entered describe it as almost ritualistic. Security gates, long corridors bathed in amber light, heavy iron doors leading into eerily quiet rooms. Wooden cabinets, centuries old, line the hallways, containing handwritten indexes older than many modern nations. Step outside your assigned area, and your access privileges may be revoked immediately. Within those shelves lie documents rumored to contain information powerful enough to reshape historical understanding, the trial transcripts of Galileo Galilei revealing not just a clash of science and faith, but of deeper political tensions. The Templar dossier, records of the secretive trials that dismantled the Knights Templar in the 14th century. Confidential letters from monarchs to popes containing negotiations and schemes never told in textbooks. Documentation related to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which carved up the New World between Spain and Portugal, legalizing centuries of colonization. In 2003, the Vatican allowed a partial release of the Templar records, specifically the interrogation of Jacques de Molay, perhaps to quell speculation. But ironically, this controlled disclosure only intensified public curiosity. If there's nothing to hide, why do nearly 90 kilometers of shelves remain off-limits? Supporters of the Vatican secrecy argue that strict protocols are necessary to prevent loss, misinterpretation, or commercialization of sensitive documents. But critics ask, when the largest archive in Christendom opens only a narrow slit, who controls history's rewrite? And more urgently, could our understanding of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment be shaped more by what's been withheld than what's been revealed? Today, the Vatican's secret archives remain a mythic labyrinth of memory, where letters centuries old sit in silence, waiting, or perhaps never waiting at all. And the final haunting question still hangs in the air. If the entirety of those archives were ever unveiled, what parts of human history would we be forced to rewrite? If the Vatican's secret archives symbolize the power to hide knowledge behind locked doors, then the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, represent a more subtle form of power, the ability to shape what knowledge is taught and how it's interpreted from the very beginning. Founded in 1540 during the height of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits emerged as a response to the growing influence of Lutheranism, Calvinism, and the new currents of thought that were shaking the authority of the Vatican. Ignatius of Loyola, the order's founder, quickly recognized that the Church could not rely solely on papal decrees or inquisitorial courts to reclaim its influence. What was needed was a strategy to infiltrate the roots of knowledge, the schools, universities, and intellectual centers where future elites, scholars, and leaders were formed. Within just a few decades, the Jesuits had established hundreds of colleges across Europe and its colonies, from Paris and Rome to Goa, Mexico City, and Lima. By the 17th century, Jesuit education had become the dominant path for Catholic elites. These institutions taught more than theology. They offered instruction in classical literature, mathematics, philosophy, and natural sciences. What made the Jesuits unique was their ability to combine outward tolerance with internal discipline. In classrooms, students could discuss Aristotle, Euclid, or even Copernicus, but only within a framework that upheld theological authority. Science and philosophy were welcome, but only as long as they did not challenge the supremacy of God or the salvific role of the Church. One well-known example is the Jesuits' handling of modern astronomy. When Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, Jesuit schools initially taught it as a useful mathematical hypothesis. But by the 17th century, as Galileo asserted the heliocentric model as physical reality, the Jesuits revised their curriculum. Heliocentrism could be mentioned, but only as a computational tool, not as fact. Assertions that Earth moved around the Sun were removed from official instruction. Likewise, in philosophy, the Jesuits maintained firm control through the Ratio Studiorum, their official guide to education, published in 1599. This detailed document listed which texts could be taught, which passages must be omitted, and how to interpret them in ways that would not provoke religious doubt. Thinkers like Descartes and Francis Bacon could be quoted, but only insofar as their ideas were framed as servants of faith. On the one hand, the Jesuits preserved classical knowledge that might have otherwise been lost amid religious and political turmoil. They helped spread science, linguistics, and archaeology, especially in Asia and Latin America. But on the other hand, many historians have questioned whether their strict intellectual oversight shaped the Western understanding of history and philosophy in ways that ensured it would never undermine ecclesiastical power. The effects of this educational strategy endured for centuries. Many of Europe's most influential administrators, from Spanish and Portuguese bureaucracies to French aristocracy, were trained in Jesuit colleges. They emerged with a pre-shaped worldview. Science and knowledge were valuable, but only when kept beneath a metaphysical ceiling enforced by the Church. Even after the temporary suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, due to pressure from secular monarchies, their educational legacy survived. The Ratio Studiorum continued to influence curricula, and the idea of soft ideological supervision remained embedded in many European universities. Today, the Jesuits are often admired for their discipline and academic rigor, keepers of high intellectual standards in times of crisis. But quietly, many scholars still wonder, when an institution is at once a missionary, a censor, and a teacher, can objective knowledge ever be truly free of intent? And like the Vatican archives, the silent presence of Jesuit curricula reminds us, the most dangerous kind of knowledge suppression may not be what's forbidden outright, but what is allowed, only within boundaries drawn by those who rule the narrative. After centuries of curricula shaped by the Church and religious institutions, the Age of Enlightenment seemed to usher in a new era where reason and science reclaimed the authority to define reality. But even in the modern world, where geometry is taught as a purely mathematical discipline, a quiet question remains. Have the deeper meanings of ancient geometric symbols been reduced, or even deliberately erased, until only their technical shells remain? The concept of sacred geometry exists in nearly all ancient civilizations. The Egyptians built pyramids according to the Golden Ratio. The Greeks designed the Parthenon with precise harmonic proportions. Indian mandalas were mapped on energetic and symbolic geometry. In esoteric traditions, Circles, spirals, six-pointed stars, and lotus patterns weren't just construction tools, they were metaphors for cosmic order, expressions of the link between spirit and matter. But as modern science advanced, especially in the 19th century, geometry became severed from its philosophical and spiritual context. In today's schoolbooks, geometry is distilled into a set of rigid definitions: points, lines, angles, polygons. Symbols like the flower of life, Metatron's cube, or the divine ratio have been relegated to the margins of mysticism or conspiracy, with no place in standard curricula. Researchers such as Keith Critchlow and Robert Lawler have argued that this separation was not just academic, it was intentional, a deliberate desacralization of knowledge, stripping symbols of their storytelling power and reducing them to soulless math problems. In an era of extreme rationalism, anyone who references the symbolic dimensions of form is easily dismissed as unscientific, despite millennia of use in architecture, agriculture, and traditional medicine. Consider the flower of life, found etched into temple walls at Abydos in Egypt, Renaissance-era tombstones, and Islamic mosaics. Many 19th to 20th century scholars acknowledged its universal significance, but as the idea of a cosmic geometric web became inconvenient to materialist narratives, textbooks slowly phased out any metaphysical interpretation. Or take the pentagram, a five-pointed star. To Pythagoreans, it symbolized harmony, health, and the microcosm, the human being, in relation to the universe. In the Middle Ages, it became associated with magic and was denounced by the Church. By modern times, out of fear of religious backlash, Western textbooks refer to it only as a five-pointed star, used to teach angles and symmetry while ignoring its philosophical roots. Some say this shift is merely the natural result of specialization, mathematics split from philosophy, science split from spirituality. But this raises a deeper question. By erasing the sacred layer of meaning, have we lost part of civilization's memory? For our ancestors, geometry wasn't just about measurement, it was a language to express what words could not. Even in the 21st century, architects like Christopher Alexander and his team have tried to revive the spirit of sacred geometry in design. They argue that certain shapes, proportions, and spatial rhythms have direct psychological and physiological effects. Yet such views remain on the fringes, rarely incorporated into the training of new architects. Today, when we open a geometry textbook, we see diagrams and formulas, sharp edges and angles, but we see few explanations for why these shapes once mattered so deeply to those before us. And perhaps this is the quietest loss of all. When knowledge becomes purely technical, it loses its voice, its ability to tell stories, to connect, to inspire. The very qualities that once allowed humans not only to measure the world, but to find meaning within it. If the distortion of sacred geometry reduced ancient symbols to soulless diagrams, then the story of ancient Mesopotamian archaeology reveals a different pattern, one where language itself was retranslated, edited, and interpreted through the lens of existing assumptions about civilization. When 19th century European archaeologists first excavated the ruins of Sumer and Akkad, the great civilizations of the Mesopotamian cradle, they unearthed a massive corpus of cuneiform texts. These clay tablets contained everything from tax ledgers and trade contracts to legal codes and cosmic myths. Their discovery shattered long-held Western beliefs that human progress began in Egypt and Greece. Instead, it became clear that Sumerians had already built cities, legal systems, and writing as early as the 4th millennium BCE. But because these findings were so foundational, the translation of cuneiform quickly became a battleground for academic and ideological control. As early as the late 1800s, scholars, particularly those in Britain and France, were often compelled to shape their translations to suit the expectations of their patrons and academic institutions. In this environment, sensitive passages were either softened, omitted, or reworded if they clashed with biblical narratives or prevailing religious views. A clear example is the Epic of Atrahasis, a Sumerian flood myth that mirrors the story of Noah. While the parallels were striking, George Smith's 1876 translation selectively included only the non-controversial sections, leaving out key moments, such as the god Enlil's remorse for wiping out humanity. That particular detail, that gods might be fallible, was too theologically unsettling for its time. Only in the 20th century did full translations emerge, but by then, school curricula had already adopted the simplified version. Similarly, early translations of Sumerian legal codes, precursors to Hammurabi's laws, were often tailored to emphasize similarities to the Old Testament, reinforcing the biblical authority over moral law. Important differences, such as restorative justice models or social compensation, were often downplayed or removed entirely from commentary. Another rarely discussed case is the Sumerian king list, which describes dynasties that ruled for tens of thousands of years. In 19th and 20th century editions, many scholars adjusted these timelines, converting 28,800 years to 288 years, to avoid clashing with biblical chronologies. Only in direct transliterations of the original texts do the original, vast numbers remain. Most widely circulated translations feature corrected versions designed to be more palatable. And here lies the deeper issue. These translations shaped how modern education presents Mesopotamian civilization. When an ancient culture is filtered through the politics and theology of a later age, our ability to understand it honestly becomes profoundly limited. To be fair, later generations of scholars have worked hard to correct this. Since the mid-20th century, independent research teams in Germany, the US, and Japan have released more complete, line-by-line translations, cross-referenced with original cuneiform signs. Yet ironically, these more accurate versions are rarely found in standard textbooks, which tend to favor older, simplified editions that are easier to teach and less likely to provoke controversy. Today, anyone interested in Sumer and Akkad faces a choice: read concise, safe summaries that strip out complexity, or wade through thousands of pages of dense sign charts in pursuit of the civilization's authentic voice, a voice often stranger, more nuanced, and more sophisticated than modern frameworks are ready to acknowledge. And perhaps the final question is not whether this distortion was done with malice, but whether it stemmed from a quiet fear of confronting truths that simply didn't fit the stories we were already told. If the mistranslation of Sumerian texts shows how knowledge can be shaped at the level of language, then the story of out-of-sequence archaeological discoveries reveals a deeper fear: that science too can punish those who question its foundational assumptions. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, numerous archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists published shocking findings: tools, human traces, or signs of civilization appearing in geological layers far too old for modern humans, or any civilization, to have existed. These announcements didn't just stir debate, they destroyed careers. One of the most infamous cases is that of Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre, an American geologist. In 1966, she participated in a survey at Hueyatlaco, Mexico, where colleagues discovered sophisticated stone tools buried beneath volcanic ash. Using multiple dating methods, including uranium and zircon analysis, her team dated the site to approximately 250,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens were believed to exist, let alone craft tools. Initially, the team prepared to publish their findings. But the backlash came swiftly. Experts dismissed the dating as flawed, suggesting the tools had fallen into older strata, or that measurements were mistaken. When Stain McIntyre stood by the data, she was quietly sidelined. Scientific journals refused to publish her work. Teaching contracts were withdrawn. Years later, she still could not find a permanent research position. In a personal letter, she wrote, "I wasn't rejected for weak data. I was rejected because my data didn't fit the story they wanted to preserve." Another case is Thomas Lee, a Canadian archaeologist. In the 1950s, he excavated thousands of stone artifacts near Lake Huron, Ontario, found within glacial soil layers. These suggested human presence in North America tens of thousands of years earlier than the accepted Bering Land Bridge theory. When Lee refused to back down, the museum employing him cut his funding, removed the collection from exhibition, and relegated it to storage. He was dismissed and spent the rest of his life unable to secure funding for new research. Then there's Michael Cremo, author of Forbidden Archaeology, who spent years collecting forgotten archaeological reports. Among hundreds of cases, he found discoveries from the 19th and 20th centuries that were removed from public archives simply for being out of sequence. Some of these can be attributed to technical error or lack of modern instruments. But many others were dismissed without any independent re-examination, only because they conflicted with established timelines. To be clear, science rightly demands rigorous standards of evidence, but the paradox is this: extraordinary data is often excluded before it can be scrutinized, discarded not for poor quality, but for being too disruptive. Today, when such findings are mentioned, mainstream science typically labels them fringe theories, unworthy of serious discussion. But independent researchers continue to ask, if the claims are wrong, why not refute them through transparent reanalysis and open replication? Why is the response so often defunding, silence, or professional exile? The answer is elusive because, like all knowledge systems, science has inertia. Once a theoretical framework is built over generations, any contradictory data is seen as a threat to order, and not everyone is willing to risk reputation, career, or meaning itself in defense of outlier evidence. And so, as often happens, the void left by these rejected discoveries becomes fertile ground for legend. Legends of prehistoric civilizations, of ancient humans more advanced than we imagined, or simply the legend of a science that, while seeking truth, still fears the data that doesn't fit its own frame. If out-of-sequence discoveries can derail a researcher's career within months, then within the quieter halls of international academic conferences, gatekeeping still exists, but it is more discreet, more polished. Here, censorship requires no formal announcement or court ruling. It often arrives through a single, carefully chosen phrase, conflicts with research direction. Academic conferences, often hosted by major universities, research foundations, or intergovernmental bodies, serve as critical platforms for introducing new discoveries, debating interpretations, and cross-checking evidence. But they are also where certain topics quietly vanish from the program, often without detailed explanation, especially when those topics touch upon chronological disputes, pre-civilizational hypotheses, or questions that challenge accepted historical frameworks. One well-known case emerged at a conference in Germany on Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old megalithic site. In 2012, a group of young Eastern European archaeologists submitted a paper questioning whether the site was not just ritualistic, but also astronomical in function, implying a level of societal organization far beyond what is expected of hunter-gatherers. The abstract was initially accepted and included in the conference program, but weeks before the event, the paper was quietly pulled with the vague note that it lacked academic maturity, a polite euphemism to avoid open controversy. In 1999, at a North American prehistory conference hosted by a U.S. university, An independent archaeologist attempted to present findings from the Topper site in South Carolina, where stone fragments suggested human activity dating back 50,000 years. The proposal passed early peer review, but when several funders objected, the organizing committee removed the paper, citing insufficient consensus. Behind closed doors, colleagues advised the researcher to accept a quiet withdrawal rather than escalate. Similar patterns appear in Egyptology conferences where papers that explore theories about undisclosed chambers beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza are frequently omitted from official programs, even though radar scans and seismic data have been published in minor proceedings. The reason given: to avoid encouraging sensationalism or damaging the scientific credibility of Egyptology. Beneath these polite rejections lies a two-layer exclusion system. The first layer is standard peer review, a necessary filter to ensure research quality. The second, subtler layer is institutional caution, where organizers and funders grow uneasy about any discovery that might destabilize the historical consensus. Some defend this system as pragmatic, not a conspiracy, but a shield against media sensationalism and pseudoscientific exploitation. After all, when an unverified theory is broadcast without scrutiny, it can erode the credibility of an entire discipline. But critics ask, if controversial data is always delayed or omitted, how can the scientific community evaluate it transparently? As a result, many such topics remain buried in internal reports or obscure journals with minimal reach. Theories about older human dates, prehistoric intercontinental trade, or early astronomical knowledge are quietly relegated outside the mainstream. And in that space, a quiet question continues to grow. How many discoveries have been blocked, not because they were wrong, but because they risked shaking the historical scaffolding we've all come to lean on? Today, as we browse the sleek programs of modern conferences, filled with hundreds of safe papers, few pause to wonder what might be missing. Somewhere beyond the printed schedule, there may exist a second list, the topics that were quietly crossed out, and may never be brought to light. If sensitive archaeological topics are often removed from international conferences to avoid controversy, then sometimes the story turns more dramatic, when physical artifacts themselves vanish, leaving behind a void with no official explanation. Among the most baffling cases stands the mysterious disappearance of 13 crates of Inca and pre-Inca artifacts lost somewhere between Peru and Europe in the early 20th century. The story began in 1926, when a joint archaeological expedition of Peruvian and French scholars excavated a site in the Ayacucho region, once a trade hub of the ancient Wari civilization, which preceded and was later absorbed by the Inca Empire. Over 4 months, they collected hundreds of artifacts, gold masks, ceramic plates engraved with strange symbols, and stone statues depicting figures wearing unfamiliar headdresses. Some of these items bore artistic elements foreign to known Inca styles, resembling carvings seen in Polynesian or Mesoamerican cultures, a detail that would later fuel speculation. According to customs records, the artifacts were sealed into 13 wooden crates, inspected and signed off by both Peruvian officials and a French archaeological commissioner. The shipment was intended to send half to Paris for restoration and comparison with the Louvre's collections, with the other half to be returned to Lima for museum display. On August 12, 1927, the cargo departed Callao port on a freight vessel bound for Le Havre, France. But when the ship arrived, the 13 crates were missing. The shipping company claimed the cargo had been unloaded at an unscheduled transfer port, but never specified which one. Insurance documentation was vague. The shipment was state-owned, so no private party had grounds to demand compensation. While the Peruvian government issued a formal request for investigation, French authorities released only a brief statement suggesting the shipment was likely misplaced in transit. and the matter quietly faded. What makes the disappearance suspicious is not only the scale, 13 sealed crates do not vanish easily, but also the nature of the contents. Some experts had photographed and sketched the items before packing. Among them were 3 stone figures resembling ancient ships, a disc engraved with coastal maps that didn't match traditional Inca geography, and a series of gold masks in a style not found in existing Peruvian collections. Various theories emerged. Some suspect the crates were stolen and sold to wealthy European collectors at a time when the black market for pre-Columbian artifacts was thriving. Others believe the disappearance was an intentional cover-up, a way to eliminate artifacts that could raise troubling questions about early transoceanic contact, a theory often rejected by mainstream historians. In 1951, a journalist from Paris Match attempted to track the missing shipment in the Le Havre archives, but all cargo records from 1927 had disappeared during World War II. Museums involved in the project also claimed to no longer hold any relevant receipts, preserving only faint correspondence between the expedition team and French cultural authorities. The complete disappearance of the 13 crates turned the story into little more than anecdote. But in 1996, a Swiss private collector displayed a gold mask he claimed was from the missing shipment. Though absolute verification was impossible, the punched decorative holes and spiral motifs closely matched a 1926 field sketch. International media picked up the story, prompting Peru's government to announce a new investigation. But once again, the files fell silent. Today, few Peruvian archaeologists are willing to revisit the case, perhaps because it raises uncomfortable questions. Who decides what evidence is preserved in national archives? Which objects accidentally vanish in transit? And which fragments of history are excluded not for being fraudulent, but for being too inconvenient? And when we confront the empty space once meant for those 13 crates, we come to a quiet realization. History doesn't always vanish in war or disaster. Sometimes it disappears in silence, shaped by the hands that control the flow of heritage. If the disappearance of 13 crates of Peruvian artifacts exposed a mysterious break in the chain of cultural transmission, then the story of the Smithsonian Institution, the largest research and museum complex in the United States, reveals a more subtle form of control. The quiet filtering of records, the restriction of access, and the guiding of public narrative toward safe conclusions. Founded in 1846, the Smithsonian's stated mission is to increase and diffuse knowledge. Yet between 1930 and 1960, a number of historians and independent researchers began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were so many thoroughly documented archaeological findings never published, or worse, quietly removed from public records? One of the most frequently cited examples involves the so-called giant skeletons. Between the 1880s and 1920s, excavation teams in the Ohio Valley and the Appalachian Mountains reported finding human remains over 8 feet tall, buried alongside copper tools and ceremonial artifacts. Preliminary reports were submitted to the Smithsonian, and some early findings appeared in publications like American Antiquarian and Scientific American. But by the 1930s, detailed records began to disappear from public archives. According to independent researchers like Vine Deloria Jr., this wasn't merely an archival oversight. In 1944, a private archaeological group requested access to examine the remains. The Smithsonian responded that the records did not exist or had been reclassified. When questioned by the U.S. Congress in 1950, Smithsonian representatives denied any policy of suppression, but also failed to produce a single document explaining why so many case files were missing from the public archive. Another story surrounds the Lovelock Cave site in Nevada, where bones, textiles, and artifacts, some dated to at least 4,000 years ago, were uncovered. Anthropologists noted that certain skulls displayed unusual morphological features not aligned with known indigenous populations. Yet by the 1950s, most of these artifacts had been removed from public exhibits, and original anthropological studies exist now only as indirect citations in obscure papers. In addition to bones, the Smithsonian during this period was suspected of filtering radiocarbon data from sites that suggested unexpectedly early human activity. At several western U.S. excavation sites, organic materials returned dates exceeding 15,000 years, well before the widely accepted Clovis first theory, which held that humans entered the Americas no earlier than 13,000 years ago. These findings were often footnoted as contaminated samples and quietly dropped from publication. Some historians argue this was not a coordinated conspiracy, but a form of institutional self-defense. When evidence contradicts a dominant theory, like Clovis first, researchers face the risk of losing credibility, funding, and academic standing. The pressure often leads to delayed publication or indefinite shelving in hopes of a more favorable scholarly climate, but the result is unmistakable: a shadow zone in American archaeology where dozens of findings were never vetted or debated by the wider scientific community. All that remains are vague ledger entries, scattered journal fragments, or second-hand recollections from those who once saw the artifacts themselves. Today, the Smithsonian remains a globally respected institution, housing millions of items and welcoming millions of visitors each year. But ask independent researchers and they'll tell you, behind the pristine displays lie storerooms only a select few can access, and perhaps case files too complicated for public release, still waiting for a generation brave enough to bring them into the light. And perhaps the real question isn't which hypothesis is correct, but rather, when silent censorship becomes habitual, how can we ever know what truths were excluded simply because they didn't fit the version of history we were prepared to accept? If archaeological records being recalled and sealed has created gaps in our understanding of the past, then in the 20th century, a more subtle form of censorship emerged, one where documentary films vanished quietly from national archives, not due to technical loss, but because they touched on historical topics too sensitive to confront. From the birth of cinema, documentary film has been a powerful tool for preserving collective memory. In the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union, hundreds of filming crews captured footage of archaeological digs, international conferences, and interviews with eyewitnesses to major historical events. Many of these films were initially designated as public assets, stored in national repositories with the promise of long-term preservation. But over time, certain reels began to disappear or become restricted, not because they were damaged or degraded, but because they revealed things beyond the comfort zone of officially accepted narratives. One frequently cited case is a film documenting early excavations at Teotihuacan, Mexico, from 1917 to 1920. The hour-long footage showed detailed close-ups of murals and foundational structures, including carvings visibly distinct from later Aztec styles. According to historians who viewed it, the film hinted that Teotihuacan may have originated from an even older culture, with possible trade connections to both Central America and the Andes. Initially housed in the Library of Congress, the film was quietly labeled restricted in the 1950s, just as new dating hypotheses were being rejected as speculative. Though brief segments appeared in other documentaries, the full original film was never released. When Archaeology magazine requested access in 1973, they were told the film had been temporarily withdrawn for content review. That status has not changed since. A similar story comes from the UK, where a 1936 film titled The Hidden Mounds documented surveys of ancient earthworks in Somerset. The footage included a scene where archaeologists appeared visibly surprised to uncover Roman-style floral brickwork beneath sediment layers dated to the Bronze Age. Initially screened publicly in the 1940s, the film was later removed from archives in the 1960s during a catalogue review by the Historic Preservation Office. The stated reason: unverified accuracy. Some copies held by regional libraries were recalled for indefinite storage. Even in the post-war era, when transparency was supposedly the new standard, numerous films received the sensitive material designation. In the US, the National Archaeological Archive once held footage from Nevada excavations where stone tools were found in layers deemed too ancient for the prevailing Clovis first theory. After limited test screenings, the film vanished from public circulation. Only a few still images remain in older research volumes. Some argue these removals are not evidence of malice, but of caution. In a media-driven society, a misinterpreted clip can quickly become a sensational claim, undermining public trust in mainstream academia. But others push back. If the public only sees pre-approved, safe narratives, then silence itself becomes the breeding ground for conspiracy. To this day, restricted film catalogues still exist in national repositories. Official reasons range from historical sensitivity, lack of scientific consensus, to protecting the reputations of individuals involved. Yet most independent researchers agree, without transparency and open review, we'll never know what these films truly contain, or why they were locked away in the first place. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: we live in a digital age, an era of open data and instant access, yet entire visual records remain in sealed vaults, their contents hidden not by decay or disaster, but by decisions that deemed them inconvenient to the stories we've grown comfortable telling. When we speak of historical fragments sidelined for being too sensitive, few artifacts have stirred as much long-standing debate as the Piri Reis map, a 500-year-old piece of gazelle skin often cited as an enigma that defies the conventional narrative of post-medieval cartography. Piri Reis, an admiral of the Ottoman Navy, a geographer and an explorer, drew the map in 1513 using a variety of sources collected from sailors, merchants, and even maps attributed to the Franks, the Ottoman term for various European peoples. Only 1/3 of the original map survives, and it's currently held at the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. At first glance, the map resembles typical 16th century porcelain charts, detailed coastlines, nautical routes, and annotations describing coastal fauna and peoples. But what has kept this map at the center of scholarly and popular debate is its southern section, a depiction of land that stretches well beyond South America, bearing a striking resemblance to Antarctica's coastline. According to accepted history, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820. Yet Piri Reis not only acknowledged its existence but illustrated its coastal contour with uncanny accuracy, particularly the curved coastline of Queen Maud Land, which modern satellite imagery confirms. Proponents of the ancient, unacknowledged cartography theory argue that the map's depiction mirrors pre-glacial terrain, suggesting it might have drawn from sources dating to a time when Antarctica was not yet covered in ice. Mainstream academia, however, has long met such claims with caution. For decades, Western institutions have classified this portion of the map as imaginative embellishment, a Renaissance cartographic habit of filling unknown regions with speculative coastlines. This interpretation made its way into textbooks and museum displays, effectively neutralizing the map's more provocative implications by celebrating it as a curious blend of fact and fantasy. Yet not all scholars agreed. Charles Hapgood, a historian of science at Keene College, became the most prominent figure championing the idea that Piri Reis's map was based on far older source materials. In his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood provided detailed geodetic analysis, arguing that the projection techniques used were far too accurate for the early 1500s. He even consulted with the US Air Force, which reportedly confirmed notable similarities between the map and subglacial topography. Despite this, Hapgood's work was largely dismissed by mainstream geography and history departments for lacking corroborating archaeological evidence. Others avoided the topic altogether, wary that the debate had been co-opted by fringe theorists and proponents of Atlantis-style speculation. Over the years, books and documentaries about the Peary Race map have been filed under the semi-academic label, where the line between serious inquiry and sensationalism blurs. As a result, the general public is rarely exposed to the full debate. Was the map simply a clever fusion of known coastlines and imaginative filler, or a clue to a maritime knowledge base that once existed and was later lost? Today, the Peary Race map remains behind glass in Istanbul, muted under layers of UV filtering protection. Visitors admire the ancient drawings, but most leave with a neatly packaged explanation, a beautiful map, but inaccurate. And perhaps that quiet dismissal is the most telling part of all, because sometimes the easiest way to neutralize an inconvenient artifact isn't to ban it, but simply to reduce it to imaginative artwork and let time do the rest. If the Peary Race map hints at maritime knowledge that defied its age, then the story of ancient Polynesian navigation makes an even bolder point. Have we silently narrowed humanity's collective memory of seafaring to fit the belief that discovery was a European invention? For centuries, Polynesians crossed the Pacific Ocean aboard massive double-hulled canoes, waka, capable of traveling thousands of kilometers across open sea without compasses or paper maps. Instead, they relied on mental navigation charts, memorized through chants and rituals, using star paths, wave shapes, wind scents, and the seasonal migration of seabirds. These routes were passed from generation to generation through oral tradition, not writing. When Spanish, Dutch, and British explorers began landing in Tahiti, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, between the 16th and 18th centuries, they were stunned by the locals' navigational precision. James Cook himself wrote in his journals, "They drew in the sand a chart more intricate than any sea map we carried." What is rarely acknowledged today is that many early European expeditions documented these native routes meticulously, using them as reference for trade and military voyages. In the naval archives of Britain, France, and Spain, handwritten maps and travel logs described anchoring points, wind directions, ocean depths, and seasonal movement patterns shared by Polynesian navigators. Some records even note that European captains hired local wayfinders to guide their transoceanic journeys. Yet by the 19th century, as European empires sought to claim the prestige of maritime discovery, these native routes quietly vanished from official naval manuals. One little-known example is the Tahiti-New Zealand sea route, recopied in Sydney in 1826 and stored in the British Admiralty archives. It depicted not only island positions but also included annotations about wave rhythms and a navigation technique called te lapa, the subtle flashes of light transmitted through ocean swells, allowing island detection from great distances. By the late 19th century, this document was reclassified as ethnographic notes, no longer considered valid maritime data. Likewise, in the 1860s, French naval manuals, there existed a section on routes through Tuamotu, Rapa Nui, and the Marquesas Islands, with Polynesian wind direction markers. But in later editions, this section disappeared, without explanation, its content preserved only in scattered references within the French National Library. Why were these routes removed? Some historians argue it was a natural result of standardization, as European navies adopted magnetic compasses, sextants, and chronometers, rendering oral navigation seemingly obsolete. But researchers like David Lewis, author of We, the Navigators, argue otherwise, that the omission reflected a deeper dismissal of indigenous knowledge because it didn't align with the story of Europe as the sole discoverer of the world's oceans. In the 20th century, as post-colonial studies gained ground, Polynesian navigators began to reconstruct ancient routes through live expeditions. The most famous was the voyage of the Hokulea canoe, guided by Maupiailug, a Micronesian wayfinder, who sailed 4,800 kilometers from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 without modern instruments. The journey's success forced the world to admit these so-called mythic skills were real and astonishingly accurate. Today, many of the hand-drawn maps once dismissed as folklore are being digitized, though few members of the public realize that for over a century they were legitimate navigational records, until quietly removed from mainstream history to preserve the myth of Western maritime supremacy. And perhaps the most sobering thought is this: when a people leave no written records, their knowledge is easily discounted, even if that knowledge once carried them halfway across the planet, long before Europeans knew how vast the world truly was. If the disappearance of Polynesian sea routes from official records reflected a subtle dismissal of indigenous knowledge, then this story carries even more weight. The hypothesis that African sailors may have reached the Americas before Columbus, once discussed in early 20th century archaeological literature, has since been pushed to the margins of history. For decades, mainstream narratives of the Western Hemisphere have rested on the idea that Columbus was the first to connect the old and new worlds, beginning the so-called Age of Discovery. Yet scattered across Central and South America, there are puzzling traces: stone carvings of unfamiliar facial features, unusual alloyed copper artifacts, and seed remains not native to the Americas. One of the first scholars to raise this issue was Leo Wiener, a Harvard linguist. In his 3-volume work, Africa and the Discovery of America, 1920 to 1922, he argued that certain techniques for processing cotton and banana cultivation in Mexico and Peru bore remarkable similarities to West African methods. He also pointed to linguistic overlaps, ritual customs, and artistic motifs that resembled Mande and Yoruba traditions. Though critics dismissed these as mere coincidences, Wiener's work was initially regarded as serious scholarship for a time. In the 1960s and 70s, historian Ivan van Sertima reignited the debate with his controversial book, They Came Before Columbus, 1976. He went further, claiming the colossal Olmec stone heads, carved with broad noses and full lips, were stone memories of contact with West African sailors or merchants in the 13th to 14th centuries. He cited Spanish colonial records in which Balboa and other chroniclers described dark-skinned people living along the Panamanian coast. But from that point on, the theory met intense resistance. Many academic institutions labeled it fringe scholarship, citing a lack of genetic or archaeological proof. By the 1980s, American history textbooks had almost entirely removed references to African pre-Columbian contact. In modern curricula, the Olmec heads are described as distinctively indigenous, and any alternative interpretations are bracketed as unaccepted theories. The irony is that some aspects of the argument were never fully debunked. For example, the presence of Old World cotton species, Gossypium herbaceum, in pre-Columbian archaeological layers remains unexplained. Botanists have acknowledged that transoceanic seed dispersal cannot be ruled out, yet such data are excluded from mainstream textbooks due to lack of consensus. At major archaeological conferences, proposals for panels on this topic have been repeatedly declined. The reason is usually diplomatic, to avoid unnecessary political or racial controversy. But in doing so, the public is denied access to open scholarly debate, and the evidence remains hidden from meaningful scrutiny. Modern researchers like Runoko Rashidi and Clyde Winters continue gathering supporting data, but their work is often dismissed as peripheral. Still, the appeal of the idea endures because it poses a compelling question. If Africans once crossed the Atlantic, does the entire narrative of the discovery of the Americas change from a story of conquest to a far more complex meeting of civilizations? Today, this theory is largely absent from official curricula. The Olmec heads remain on quiet display in museums, labeled simply circa 1200 to 400 BCE, with no definitive explanation for why their facial features don't resemble any other Mesoamerican sculpture. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable question of all. When a hypothesis doesn't fit the standardized, Eurocentric story, is it ever truly given a fair chance? Or is it quietly excluded simply because it forces us to redefine who arrived first? If pre-Columbian transoceanic journeys challenge Eurocentric narratives of first contact, then Pumapunku, a megalithic complex resting silently on Bolivia's Altiplano plateau, poses a different kind of riddle. How did a civilization with no written records produce stonework so precise that even modern engineers struggle to replicate it? Pumapunku, part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological site, consists of enormous sandstone and diorite blocks, some weighing tens of tons, carved with mirror-smooth finishes and precisely drilled holes. Many of the H-shaped stones feature parallel surfaces accurate to within a millimeter, with beveled edges consistent across the entire perimeter, attributes that even today leave modern stonemasons astonished. The first major studies were conducted by Arthur Poznański in the early 20th century. Over nearly 5 decades, he measured, mapped, and compared the site's alignments with astronomical data. In his final years, Poznański concluded that Pumapunku might be over 15,000 years old, an estimate that drew fierce opposition from European archaeologists of the time. After his death, his research was scattered, and much of it was never published in full. In the 1950s, new excavation teams from the US and Germany returned to Tiwanaku, while radiocarbon dating of nearby agricultural layers suggested a more conservative age of about 1,500 years. No further investigation into how the stones were shaped was pursued. By the end of the 20th century, despite the blocks remaining fully exposed and intact, official excavation at Pumapunku had largely ceased. A lingering question remains: why hasn't a full survey using laser scanning and modern tools been organized? Independent researchers like Christopher Dunn, along with geological engineering teams, have conducted their own surveys, suggesting that the diorite shaping requires techniques beyond hammer and copper chisel. Yet proposals for formal research funding are almost always rejected, with the stated reason being a lack of theoretical framework. Some academics argue that limited archaeology budgets should prioritize sites with writing or rich textual history. But others find this rationale insufficient, especially since Pumapunku's stones sit above ground, easily accessible, requiring no deep excavation. That very convenience, critics argue, makes the silence even more suspicious. Is this a calculated quiet meant to avoid difficult questions? Today, when tourists visit Pumapunku, local guides mention the great Tiwanaku civilization, then quickly move on. There is no detailed exhibit on stone shaping techniques, no discussion of how blocks weighing over 100 tons were moved across highland terrain. A single sign reads Pumapunku circa 5th to 10th century CE, and nothing more. There, in the thin air of the high Andes, the stones remain, massive, immobile, and eerily precise. Not supernatural, perhaps, but when research teams decline to return, and when modern surveys are postponed or cancelled indefinitely, silence itself becomes a form of soft censorship, subtle but highly effective. What makes Pumapunku so extraordinary may not be just the stones, but the way it reveals how even archaeology can flinch in the face of what it cannot easily explain, choosing instead to look away in order to preserve the narrative status quo. And so the blocks are left to weather under sun and rain, as if time alone might erase the question, along with the hands that once shaped them. If Pumapunku raises uncomfortable questions about technology beyond its time, then the story of the Olmec civilization's ethnic origins reveals a different kind of discomfort, a reluctance to acknowledge that pre-Columbian transoceanic contact may have shaped a legacy more complex than the tidy narrative of isolated development. The Olmecs, emerging around 1500 BCE along Mexico's Gulf Coast, are widely considered the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, laying the cultural groundwork for the Maya, Aztec, and others. They left behind pyramids, an early hieroglyphic system, and most iconically, a series of colossal stone heads, each weighing 20 to 50 tons, whose facial features have sparked debate for over a century. The giant heads, found at La Venta and San Lorenzo, display broad noses, full lips, and low cheekbones, traits distinctly different from the stylized faces seen in other Mesoamerican art. Early observers, including Matthew Stirling, who led the 1938 American excavation, remarked on the heads' non-native features and noted their resemblance to West African morphology. Stirling, however, stopped short of drawing any definitive conclusions. By the 1960s and 1970s, amid the U.S. civil rights movement, some African-descended scholars, notably Ivan van Sertima, openly proposed that the Olmec heads were stone-carved memories of transatlantic contact, possibly with Mande merchants or Mali sailors. His 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, introduced this theory to the public, offering comparative facial analysis and Spanish colonial records describing dark-skinned people along the coast of Panama. But that moment also marked the beginning of a strong pushback. By the 1980s, most mainstream academic institutions began reframing the Olmec heads in schoolbooks and museum exhibits. Where once some scholars cautiously suggested African resemblance, newer interpretations emphasized stylized aesthetics, calling the heads idealized depictions of local rulers. Some texts argued that the broad features were symbolic of authority, not literal representations. This interpretation is not entirely without merit. No direct DNA evidence has linked the Olmecs to Africa, and morphological comparisons can oversimplify complex ethnic identities. But what concerns many independent researchers is not the debate itself, but how the topic has been quietly removed from public discourse rather than evaluated in open, critical discussion. In 1990, an international Olmec conference at Tulane University planned a roundtable titled Morphological Elements and the Possibility of Transoceanic Contact. But just months before the event, the panel was cancelled, with organizers citing the need to avoid racially charged controversy. The topic vanished from the official proceedings. Even in Mexico, the National Institute INAH remains cautious. While some local scholars acknowledge the head's atypical features, they typically offer neutral interpretations like an elite stylistic tradition, avoiding deeper implications. So the question lingers, why do the colossal heads bear such unmistakably distinct features if there were no external contact at all? Some independent researchers continue to suggest West African voyages or foreign merchant classes influencing elite imagery, but these theories rarely make it into mainstream educational materials. Historians note that the silence may not stem from a coordinated conspiracy, but from a post-colonial hypersensitivity around race. Scholars fear being misinterpreted or aligned with political extremism, from white supremacist pseudo-history to overzealous Pan-Africanism, and so rather than risk controversy, the field opts for silence. Yet that silence may be the most dangerous space of all. When debate is shut down entirely, truth, whatever it may be, becomes fertile ground for myth, speculation, and polarization. Today, visitors stand before the Olmec heads, their stone eyes fixed on the horizon. The museum label reads simply, Olmec head, circa 900 BCE, distinct artistic style. No further comment, no deeper context. And perhaps that's the most difficult question of all. If a civilization truly was more complex than our standardized histories allow, are we willing to accept that cultural identity was never just about borders or skin color? Or will we continue to choose the version of history that feels more comfortable? If the Olmec heads challenged archaeologists with unfamiliar faces, then the story of certain ancient Chinese world maps reveals something even more unsettling. That global geographical knowledge may have been far more advanced in China before Europe's so-called Age of Discovery, yet was quietly shelved and sealed away for centuries. Among the most debated examples is the Qianlong Quangqiu II, the Qianlong Global Map, a large hand-painted silk scroll believed to have been completed in the early Qing dynasty. The map appeared in imperial archives around 1763, and while it portrays Asia, Europe, and Africa with surprising accuracy, its depictions of the American coastlines and eastern island chains are what puzzle researchers the most. The annotations describe territories that resemble Polynesia and even New Zealand. The Qianlong map was not unique. Other versions, like the Haiwei Guo Tu, map of overseas countries, circulated in limited circles used by scholars and Qing diplomatic missions. In these maps, America is labeled Great Western Continent, Dashizhou, and the southern polar region is marked as White Lands, described as a place of eternal snow, inaccessible to ships. In the 19th century, several Western scholars became intrigued by these maps. Some dismissed them as Jesuit-inspired hybrids, borrowing from European knowledge introduced to China during the Ming era. But the problem was, several details didn't align with European maps of the time. Notably, the Qianlong map shows a continuous west coast of the Americas stretching from north to south, while European maps of the same period still treated California as a potential island. Modern Chinese scholars such as Professor Luo Xin have proposed that these maps may have drawn from a range of sources: Arab maritime data, Ming dynasty navigator accounts, and merchant folklore. Others are more cautious, treating them as semi-fantastical political statements aimed at reinforcing the Qing dynasty's image of a world under all tributary vision. Whatever their origins, one fact stands out. From the late 18th century, the Qing court ordered these maps sealed, labeling them imperial property and strictly forbidding reproduction. According to the Qing Veritable Records, Qing Shilu, a 1790 edict instructed the Ministry of Rights to catalogue over 200 sensitive maps, citing concerns about revealing frontier and foreign territories to outsiders. When the Qing dynasty collapsed, many maps were lost or damaged. A few surviving scrolls were sold abroad in the early 20th century and now sit in private collections across Europe and Japan. Due to fragmented records, no one can definitively say whether these maps were based on first-hand observation or merely a collage of speculation and rumor. What's striking is how, as European maritime dominance rose, these Chinese maps disappeared from educational narratives. In official world history, Asian geography was reduced to insular and self-contained, while Columbus and Magellan became the unchallenged heroes of global exploration. Not until the late 20th century did writers like Gavin Menzies, despite his controversial claims, bring popular attention back to the idea that Chinese explorers may have mapped more of the world than previously thought. While many historians have rejected Menzies' conclusions, they also acknowledge a crucial point. The Qing government's deliberate censorship of geographic data suggests a kind of nervousness, as if the maps revealed too much to be left unguarded. Today, within the Forbidden City's archives in Beijing, some of these ancient maps still exist, rarely digitized, rarely studied. Visitors who ask are told politely, these are imperial court documents, not representative of official geographic knowledge. And perhaps the deeper question is not whether the maps are accurate, but who decides whether a civilization's far-reaching vision of the world deserves to be remembered? When memory is sealed for convenience, history becomes easier to tell and easier to believe. If the Qing dynasty's sealing of global maps reflected a fear of knowledge straying beyond control, then in the 20th and 21st centuries, a more sophisticated form of control has emerged, not through censorship in the traditional sense, but by shaping which research is allowed to exist. This is the realm of academic gatekeeping, where invisible networks quietly determine who gets funding, who gets published, and what gets taught. To the public, academia often appears to be an open forum where logic and evidence reign supreme. But behind the scenes, there are entrenched networks of influence, where those who oversee peer review, research funding, and curriculum development often collaborate, intentionally or not, to maintain intellectual boundaries. One frequently cited example is the influence of major intergovernmental and private research funders, from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation to the U.S. Social Science Research Council. Independent scholars have long pointed out that to obtain funding for archaeological or anthropological work, researchers must first align with mainstream scientific directions. The phrase sounds harmless, but in practice it often means if your proposal suggests something too far from accepted models, such as pre-Columbian transoceanic contact or advanced prehistoric civilizations, your chances of receiving a grant plummet to near zero. The result is a paradox. Those who attempt bold inquiries must often fund their own work, only to be dismissed for lacking official academic backing. In a 1998 interview, archaeologist John Anthony West stated, "We don't lack evidence, we lack an academic system brave enough to publish it." This soft power doesn't just reside in grant committees, it thrives in editorial boards, where a select few decide what gets published. In 2002, Antiquity Journal was accused of rejecting numerous papers on new dating evidence from Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, citing the research as too speculative. An anonymous editor admitted, "We didn't want to reopen a debate the field worked hard to put to rest 50 years ago." Another layer of control lies in university curriculum boards, which determine what gets officially taught. In 2010, when faculty at a US university proposed adding a seminar on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, it was vetoed by the academic board for lacking scholarly consensus. Of course, not all of this amounts to a conspiracy. Many of these decisions stem from legitimate caution. Allowing unvetted theories into classrooms risks turning archaeology into a playground for pseudoscience. But the line between intellectual rigor and suppression can be razor-thin. Some historians call it the field's self-defense mechanism. Others are more blunt, describing it as an unnamed guild, a self-replicating network where professors train protégés who become colleagues, who then reinforce the same boundaries. The outcome is clear. Anyone stepping beyond the safety line, driven by passion or compelling data, faces professional isolation. No funding, no publications, no classroom access. Eventually they're branded as fringe. Today, if you attend a major archaeology conference, you'll see panels that look open-minded. But if you look closer, you'll notice what's absent. No serious discussion of diorite carving techniques at Pumapunku or prehistoric trans-Pacific trade. Not because these ideas have been debunked, but because they no longer fit inside the framework that academic institutions tightly preserve. And perhaps the most chilling truth isn't that some secret society is pulling the strings, but that an unspoken agreement now exists where no one needs to say out loud that certain questions shouldn't be asked. and certain truths shouldn't be spoken. If traditional academic gatekeeping relied on controlling funding and publications, then the digital age has introduced a new, subtler form of censorship, one built not on overt bans, but on algorithms and invisible editorial policies that quietly shape what the public sees when they search for knowledge. Many people assume that Wikipedia, Google Scholar, and other open access platforms are free spaces where all viewpoints coexist and all sources are equally archived. In reality, these platforms enforce stringent editorial hierarchies and ranking systems, so much so that certain controversial topics nearly vanish from public view. Wikipedia, with over 6 million English-language articles, claims to adhere to a principle of neutral point of view. Yet few realize that articles flagged as controversial, such as pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, Piri Reis map, or ancient advanced civilizations, are locked for editing for most users. Control over these entries rests with a small cadre of administrators and trusted editors who have the power to remove citations, label sections as conspiracy theories, or suppress certain pages from Wikipedia's internal search results. In a 2017 interview, a former senior Wikipedia editor, pseudonymously JM, admitted, "There are articles we deliberately structure with bias, not because we know the content is wrong, but because no one wants Wikipedia associated with conspiracy theory culture." Google Scholar, the world's largest academic search engine, uses algorithms that prioritize journal prestige and citation count. This might sound reasonable, but it results in monopolizing visibility for mainstream journals, many of which avoid publishing controversial hypotheses. Independent research published in small or non-traditional journals gets buried in obscurity, rarely seen by average users. In 2015, a research team at the University of North Carolina conducted an experiment. They searched for pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas. In the top 100 Google Scholar results, only 2 articles seriously explored the hypothesis. The rest were dismissive or skeptical. More than 50 original papers, published in lesser-known journals or conference proceedings, were nowhere to be found. Another mechanism is content steering, where search suggestions automatically lead users away from controversial topics. Search for Pumapunku advanced stonework, and Google immediately suggests Pumapunku hoax, Pumapunku debunked, or ancient aliens theory, subtly branding all curiosity as fringe or false. Even platforms like academia.edu and ResearchGate, praised for openness, use filtering systems. While users can upload papers freely, content tagged with labels like pseudo-archaeology or fringe theory is quietly deranked, excluded from main directories and discipline feeds. Some papers are even removed silently if reported for violating vague academic standards, often without public peer review. To be fair, these precautions often arise from a legitimate concern. The spread of misinformation is a real threat in the digital age, but the line between public protection and intellectual manipulation is not always clear. When a handful of editors and algorithm designers decide what appears first, or not at all, they effectively control which questions may be asked and which voices may be heard. Some younger scholars argue that true open knowledge must include uncomfortable hypotheses, provided they are supported by primary sources and scholarly discourse. Yet most platforms still choose the easier route, warning labels, suppressed rankings, or quietly burying results on page 10 when no one looks. Perhaps the most unsettling question is not whether these platforms are hiding something enormous, but whether now that censorship has shifted from visible hands to invisible code, anyone still dares to ask, what piece of the puzzle are we missing? If modern censorship on platforms like Wikipedia and Google Scholar is a product of the digital age, then during the stormy decades of the Cold War, a more discrete mechanism of control evolved, one where intelligence agencies quietly partnered with archaeological expeditions. Following World War II, as the US and the Soviet Union entered into global confrontation, archaeology suddenly became a strategic tool, a means of accessing sensitive geopolitical zones under the cover of scientific research. Declassified files now reveal that many international dig teams were dual-purpose operations involved in gathering geographic data, mapping supply routes, and even recruiting local informants. One notable example is Project Mallory, a CIA-backed initiative that ran from the late 1940s through the 1960s. Presented publicly as a prehistoric cultural survey of Central Asia, it allowed experts from the US, Britain, and Germany to access areas such as the Pamir Mountains and the Afghan border, regions then off-limits to most foreign press. While publicly framed as Bronze Age research, declassified documents released in 1998 confirmed that expeditions also collected satellite imagery, soil samples, and logistical maps for military purposes. In the Soviet Union, archaeology was similarly entangled with geopolitics. During the 1950s, expeditions to Central Asia and Mongolia, overseen by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, were designed not only to explore ancient cultures, but to legitimize Russia's historical dominance in the region. These missions were used to argue that these territories fell within a civilizational zone of Russian influence. Some Soviet archaeologists later admitted that they also collected ethnographic data, in part for academic study and in part for internal security profiling. The collaboration between archaeology and intelligence didn't end in Asia. Across the Middle East, from Iran to Iraq and Syria, many Western archaeological teams, especially from the US and UK, received indirect funding from covert agencies. For example, excavation at Sumerian sites in Iraq during the 1950s and 60s was formally managed by a cultural foundation, but budget records later revealed that up to 60% of funding came from the US State Department and CIA. The mission had dual goals, documenting Mesopotamian heritage and monitoring Soviet-aligned political factions. In some cases, this arrangement had unintended benefits. Well-funded digs uncovered and preserved significant sites that might otherwise have been ignored. But there was a cost. Findings that didn't align with political agendas were often delayed, redacted, or never published. One rarely discussed example is the Kalatka Darband site in northern Iraq, where certain architectural features suggest a timeline older than officially accepted models. Early data was withheld from publication, citing military sensitivity and inconsistencies with approved historical frameworks. After the Cold War, some historians began asking hard questions. Did archaeology become a tool of state-sponsored myth-making? At a 1996 symposium, historian Peter der Manuelian remarked, "We must accept that sometimes, when we look at a photo of an excavation, we're also seeing a political message." To this day, many archaeological project files from 1945 to 1975 remain sealed in the archives of the CIA, MI6, and GRU. Independent researchers who request access usually receive polite but firm replies. No relevant records found. And perhaps the most troubling aspect isn't that archaeology was used for intelligence. That much seems inevitable during a global conflict. It's the dangerous precedent such entanglements set. When science and political power merge, the boundary between genuine research and strategic propaganda dissolves, leaving behind a historical record that is blurred, distorted, and harder than ever to decipher. From burned libraries and sealed maps to ruined sites and vanished archaeological expeditions, one thing becomes clear. History has never been a fixed monument. It is a river, shaped by power, ambition, and fear, quietly redirected over thousands of years. When an empire burns books, it doesn't just destroy parchment, it erases collective memory. When an academic board agrees to ignore inconvenient findings, it's not just caution, it becomes a wall against independent thought. When digital platforms label uncomfortable ideas as conspiracy, they silently appoint themselves as gatekeepers of truth. Perhaps the most frightening thing is not forgetting, but the way history is rewritten again and again with new layers of polish until we can no longer tell what is evidence and what is echo. In this journey, we have seen unmistakable examples. Olmec stone heads bearing faces unlike any known Mesoamerican group, rebranded as stylized artistic forms. Ancient world maps depicting a global knowledge that predates Europe's age of discovery, sealed away and removed from textbooks. Archaeological film reels pulled from archives under the label of sensitivity, ensuring no public scrutiny. Small inner circles within academia and intelligence quietly deciding what gets funded, published and taught, pushing inconvenient theories to the margins. And if all of this is true, we must ask, is the history we are taught built on evidence or on consensus? Certainly not every story is a conspiracy, not every theory is correct, but not every doubt deserves to be dismissed either, because it is often those daring, disruptive questions that keep history alive, a living dialogue, not a manuscript sealed in the vaults of a bygone century. In the end, the most important question isn't locked in the Vatican archives, buried under the dust of the Library of Alexandria, or sealed in a safe at a forgotten dig site. It lies within us. Who gets to decide which story is told, which memory is preserved? What version of the past will the next generation believe? If there's anything truly worth preserving, it is the courage to keep asking, even when the question makes people uncomfortable, because history is not dead. It lives in every debate, every scrap of evidence, every person brave enough to say, I don't know if this is true, but I want to examine it. If you found this series thought-provoking, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what's next. Leave a comment below. Who do you believe writes history? Who holds the pen that redraws the past we're told to trust? Hit the notification bell and share this video so more voices can join the conversation. Because the past belongs to those willing to question it, and the future to those brave enough to listen.